They say that power in the Imperium is not seized but endured, and that the cost of holding it is measured not in blood, but in eternity itself. Imagine a sorcerer who has already sacrificed his soul once, bartered it to the immaterial tides of chaos, and now when all that remains of his flesh is ash and whisper, he dares to bargain again. Such a tale is not written in data-slates or stored in the vaults of Terra, for it exists only in the half-remembered confessions of dying inquisitors, the fevered dreams of astropaths, and the cursed canticles of renegades. Yet within it lies a truth about the universe, that the abyss always offers one more bargain, one final exchange of agony for power, one last door to step through when all others are closed. What is the price of apotheosis, and what kind of being pays it willingly? Before we descend into this forbidden chronicle, consider this: you are not alone in searching these hidden histories. Others who watch, who listen, who dare to linger at the edges of the immaterium, gather here as well. If you wish to walk further into the shadows with us, lend your strength to this archive, subscribe, share, and let your voice join the chorus of those who refuse to look away. Chapter I. The Silent Muster. It began with silence. Not the ordinary hush of a ship's cycle at rest, nor the mechanical lull of cogitators left humming in low power. This was a silence that bled into the bones, that gnawed at the minds of those who remained, hollowing them out with the weight of emptiness. To step into the corridors of the sorcerer's vessel was to hear the sound of absence, an echo where once there had been voices, the clang of boots, the disciplined call of warriors assembling to their posts. The ship itself seemed to mourn. Bulkheads creaked with every slow shift through void currents, as though the vessel strained under the burden of continuing without purpose. Once it had been a predator, sleek and terrible, its decks alive with the fervor of a warband bound together by oath and ambition. Now its corridors were long stretches of steel, dusted with rust and shadow, where torchlight flickered but could not pierce the gloom. Fewer than a dozen figures still walked those halls, their armor scarred, their movements heavy with fatigue, their eyes drawn ever to the void glass windows where distant stars stared back in cold indifference. The sorcerer knew silence as intimately as he knew the warp. Silence had been the cloak beneath which he first heard whispers, the stillness that had revealed truths forbidden to the Imperium. Yet this silence was different. This was not the silence of revelation, but of loss. His warband, once 100 strong, had withered to a handful. Battles fought in the Emperor's shadow, ambushes sprung by rival heretics, attrition from wounds that festered when Medicae stores ran dry. All of it had bled them thin, and those who remained looked upon him, not with reverence, but with doubt sharpened by hunger. In the mess decks, the air smelled of oil and stale nutrient paste. Helmets were set aside, revealing faces lined with weariness, scarred by shrapnel and battle, unshaven and haunted. Words came sparingly, only when necessary. Even the simplest conversation had grown brittle. There was no laughter here, no boasts of conquest or promise of plunder. The men spoke of rations, of dwindling fuel, of whether the astropath still lived after his last seizure left him twitching on the steel floor with foam upon his lips. And when they spoke of the sorcerer, it was in hushed tones, as though their own voices feared to betray them. He felt their mistrust as a weight pressing against his skin. In the warp, their thoughts were faint sparks, embers of resentment, suspicion, and fear that threatened to flare if fanned too long. They followed him still because he was the only one who could bend the tides of the immaterial, to guide their path, the only one who could keep the ship from wandering into dead space, or being pulled apart by the madness of the Empyrean. But loyalty forged only by necessity was brittle, and he knew the silence of mutiny when it crept close. In his chambers, lit by a single lumen globe that flickered as though struggling to stay alive, he unrolled the ragged parchment of old charts. Ink faded, corners frayed, they showed rows long since abandoned by the Imperium, ghost paths through forgotten sectors where derelicts drifted and stations went dark without reason. His fingers hovered above them, black gauntlet, trembling as though pulled by invisible threads. He sought not merely a destination, but a promise, an omen from the warp that his path was not yet finished. Every night, he performed the same ritual, a circle of ash traced on the steel deck, candles cut from the rendered fat of enemies long dead, words whispered in tongues that once belonged to scholars of Prospero before that world burned. Each night, he reached outward, and each night the silence pressed back. No visions, no voices, no answers, only the endless quiet of the void, punctuated by the thrum of the ship's failing heart. The silence was becoming unbearable. His warriors grew restless. Supplies would not last another month. The astropath no longer screamed visions, but simply lay in his cell, eyes rolled back, breath shallow, as if he had seen too far and broken. The sorcerer's own dreams brought no respite. He saw himself walking empty corridors, pursued not by demons or enemies, but by the soundless shadow of his own failure. Still, in that silence, something lingered, a pressure at the edges of his mind, faint, evasive, as though waiting for him to lower his guard. It was not yet a voice, not yet a bargain, but the promise of one. The fracture in the silence came as a taste first, metallic, sour, like old blood, evaporating on a forge plate. He was walking the spine corridor, gauntleted hand, trailing along blistered paint, where the ship's machine spirit had long ago fallen to muttering, when the flavor arrived with the suddenness of a memory and the certainty of a wound. He halted. The lumen strips ahead, guttered once, twice, then steadied, as if the vessel were waiting to hear what he would do. No vox hiss, no footfalls, no clatter of arms, only that taste, thin as a filament, and just as impossible to ignore. The sorcerer closed his eyes, and let it settle on his tongue until it pointed. Yes, pointed, downward toward the manufactorum decks, where the servitors worked, and the air always smelled of promethium and hot iron. He descended alone. Even the most loyal of his remaining warriors avoided the manufactorum when they could, for the place had begun to echo with rhythms that were not the rhythms of labor. Hammers struck in patterns with gaps between them, as though the ship's heart had learned to count and now found the numbers wrong. He passed through a gate where warning sigils had been etched and then charred away by some forgotten flare, and the heat hit him like a living thing. Racks of disassembled plate, spares for armor, none of them wore anymore, stood in skeletal ranks. Conveyor belts crept on, bearing nothing. The servitors tracked his passage with glassy milk-filmed eyes, mouths opening and closing on static prayers. One of them paused at a crucible and lifted its head, as if listening. He tasted that sourness again. It thickened. It became the smell of a storm, about to break on a dust world, tram lines of lightning racing behind his eyes. His staff found the deck with a soft ring. The ring did not echo. It was swallowed, as if the space around him had become a throat. He reached, not far, not into the warp proper, not yet, but along the thin skin of probability that lay atop material things like frost. If there was a presence here, it was bound to the ship's habit of repetition, to the cycle of heat and cooling, to the old songs the machine spirit had once permitted. He murmured syllables that had gotten him killed once, and had not quite stopped since. The nearest servitor twitched. Its vox grill coughed out a smear of sound that might have been a word, if the word had been broken, and then taught to limp. He stepped closer, palm raised, tasting the air as if to catch a shard of meaning on his tongue. The servitor's jaw worked. Its augmetic fingers clamped the edge of the crucible, until metal squealed. The sound that came next was small. So small that anyone unlearned would have dismissed it as a flaw in a cogwheel, but to him it was a spark dragged over oil. Not a voice, not yet. A pattern. 3 beats, a pause, 2, and then the faintest ripple through the heat haze, as though somewhere a curtain had moved. He did not break the circle of his own focus. He drew a sliver of chalk from his belt and traced a crooked line along the deck. A line taught by a master whose bones were ash in the void. He did not close it. He left the line open like a wound. The pattern trembled in answer. The hammers in the far bay fell briefly into the cadence he had just heard. 3. Pause. 2. The ship sagged, or perhaps it was his balance, and he remembered in a rush the first time he had stood under an observatory dome on Prospero, and realized the sky could be taught to speak, if you only learned how to listen. A figure appeared at the threshold. Not a daemon, not an ally. Vesk, his oldest blade, once a sergeant before titles stopped fitting, a slab of scar and iron, whose eyes had grown suspiciously careful. We heard the manufactorums singing, Vesk said, and the careful cadence of his voice made the sorcerer think of a man edging along a cliff. The men want to know if it's a sign, or another of the ship's tricks. It's neither, the sorcerer said. He kept his gaze on the open line of chalk. It's a mouth forming. You want it to speak, Vesk said. I need it to. Vesk approached, until the heat made his breath rough. He looked around at the servitors, at their mute labor. And if it tells us to turn back, then it lies, the sorcerer answered, and the certainty in him surprised him. Silence had drained certainty from him for weeks, but now even the act of denying retreat felt like a vein opening to air. We have nothing behind us but thin rations and enemies who can smell thin rations. Forward is the only direction that still resembles a word. The chalk line shivered. No, not the line, the air above it. The shimmer rose like heat mirage, and within it curled the first definite syllable, dragging itself out of absence, an invocation shaped by pressure, not sound. It denoted a coordinate. He did not hear numbers, but he knew them with the precision of a blade edge. A dead run between systems abandoned during some long-ago compliance. A corridor forgotten by the Astra Militarum, and ignored by pirates who had learned, over generations, that ships vanishing there did not even leave ghosts. He almost smiled. A mouth, he said again, softer, and a tongue. Vesk's jaw flexed. He had never liked the sorcerer's work, had tolerated it only because it had kept them alive. You'll steer us into that. I'll steer us where we're already going, the sorcerer said. This only removes the pretense. Vesk's gaze ticked to the servitors. One had stopped entirely, holding a half-poured bloom of molten feed, as still as a votive. The men will follow if there's a promise at the end, he said. They won't if it's just another whisper. Then I will make the whisper visible, the sorcerer replied. He closed the line with the last hook of chalk. The shimmer vanished like a breath taken back. He did not need more. The root had lodged in him like a splinter. Rouse the navigator. I will set the translation. We will skirt the shoals. We will not wallow. Tell them the manufactorum spoke. Tell them the ship remembered its purpose. He felt Vesk's eyes on him, weighing loyalty, fear, assassination, all the possible futures that men like Vesk could contain. At last the old blade grunted. You say what you have to, he said, and left. The sorcerer stood among the heat and the slow labor until the taste in the air thinned and the hammers drifted back into their broken rhythms. He could have pressed harder, demanded more, torn the shimmer into shapes, and repurposed it as a promise of miracles. He did not. The warp rewarded appetite and punished gluttony with the same indifference. Better to take the coordinate, the hint, and leave the rest unsaid. He climbed back to the spine, and with each level the ship altered. Bulkheads that had felt like bones began to sound like rails again. The lights warmed. The machine spirit's mutter picked up a new note, not joy. Spirits did not rejoice, but recognition, as if a hound had regained a scent on a barren plain. He passed corridors where men paused mid-task to look up, and their eyes were no longer deserted rooms. He tasted hope like warm metal between his teeth. It was cheap, that taste, but even cheap hope could be hammered into a weapon. In the bridge sanctum the navigator waited, skin pale and thin as vellum, third eye hooded and bound, fingers trembling over the hololithic. He took his place, laid his staff across the console and spoke the rote. It unfolded over the display as a faint thread through star-salt static. A skein tugged tight across the black. The navigator swallowed. Translation will be shallow, and the currents there are starved, she said. If the Geller field falters, it won't, he said. And in the saying he lent conviction to the generatorium through channels no priest would sanction. He felt the field hum deeper, like a throat clearing. He gave the order. The ship turned. Somewhere far astern, reliquaries rattled and a rack of unused helmets fell like dead bells. On the outer hull, plates flexed and locked into the posture of a predator. The void glass darkened as the warp edge drew near. Across the bridge, men and women buckled straps and whispered their own private hedges against annihilation. He let the silence fill one last time, now heavy not with emptiness but with imminence, and he breathed it like incense. In that breath he felt the shape of the bargain he would soon be forced to make, not yet a voice, not yet terms, but a direction, a promise, and the knowledge that whatever waited along this forgotten run had been waiting a very long time. The alarms chimed low. The Geller field rose around them, a skin of faith stretched over a beast's teeth. The stars thinned to threads. The warp took them like a slow tide, not a storm. The Geller field's hymn thrummed through the decks in a register that set teeth on edge, and the void glass became a skinned black mirror that reflected nothing but the ship's own pallor. The navigator's hooded third eye flickered beneath its seals, and she whispered bearings like penance. Shallow translation, the sorcerer had promised. And shallow it was, a skim along the simmering meniscus of unreality, where colors existed as pressure and thoughts bent light. Even here, even this close to the safer fringes, the Empyrean pressed greedy palms against the hull and breathed through the seams. He held his vigil by the hololithic, staff balanced across his knees, mind anchored to a triad of memories drilled into him so deeply that not even the warp could color them. A library of marble and red dust, a hand placing a glyph-stamped tabula beside his own, and the iron taste of failure on a night lit by burning books. He did not dwell. He used them like stakes hammered into permafrost. The ship rode each eddy with the wary poise of a wounded beast that still remembered hunting. Vesk stood near the primary console, helmet mag-clamped at his hip, hands loose, that careful stillness of his stretched tight. He did not look at the sorcerer except to check that he still breathed. He watched the crew. It was the old sergeant's true labor, to see a twitch before it became a knife, to smell hunger before it turned to mutiny. His gaze slid to a young blade at the secondary gunnery, Kane, whose lip trembled when he thought no one saw, and held there a heartbeat too long. Kane felt it and steadied. The astropath did not stir in her cell. She had gone beyond visions into the sort of quiet from which some never returned. They had propped her with straps and padded her with rags so she wouldn't bruise herself on the bulkhead if the ship bucked, and her breath crept out in thin fogs that smelled of salt and old copper. The sorcerer brushed her mind only once, lightly, and withdrew at once when he felt the brittle crust over a broken lake. Minutes or hours, time wilted in translation, passed in measured increments of restraint. The machine spirit's mutter held steady. The Geller field hummed its stolid argument against intrusion. Then, like a knuckle rapping beneath floorboards, something touched the ship. Not a breach, a recognition, a resonance. The hololithic fluttered. The faint thread of their plotted skein thickened, not with light, but with implication, as if some abandoned cartographer had drawn a second line atop the first. Years later, hands shaking, ink running. On the lower decks, las locks clacked as men checked charges they could not afford to spend. In the manufactorum, hammers slipped for half a beat into the old three-paws too before shame or fear, or obedience, dragged them back. The sorcerer tasted iron, not the cheap hope from earlier, but a denser flavor, like a key left too long beneath the tongue. He shifted his weight, and the field's pitch shifted with him, a cathedral's choir adjusting to a new cantor. Shoal ahead, the navigator whispered, voice cracked, the words finding their way out like miners. Currents intersecting, the skein wants to dive. Hold the skim, he said. We do not dive for a rumor. It's not a rumor, she said, and flinched as if she had startled herself by arguing. It's a groove worn by ships, old faint, but deep enough that the warp remembers. The phrase struck the bridge like a draft. Men blinked. Vesk's head turned, just enough to show he had logged the word groove and filed it under things that might be survived. The sorcerer leaned forward until the staff's ferrule clicked against the deck. Thread the groove without surrendering to it, he said. Let its memory carry us, not command us. The navigator's lips moved. The hood seals flexed, The Geller field answered by an increment too small for human senses, but the ship felt it, and the ship obliged. The hololithic showed nothing and everything. A line crossing a fog, dots like freeze-burn marks where other lines had crossed once and then vanished. They broke translation as gently as a hand lifting from water. The stars jumped back into definition with the vertigo of a curtain ripping. A yellow dwarf burned lean and resentful ahead, its light knifing through a spread of shattered rock that had once been more. On their left, like a shrine someone had tried to forget, hung a station, skeletal gantries, torn docking spines, a ring broken into 3 clamped crescents. Its skin bore the ghost of Mechanicum chevrons long overpainted by neglect, a catechism of hazard glyphs and service codes eroded into anonymity. It drifted with the poise of a corpse that had not yet begun to fall apart. Silence filled the bridge with a new density. Engines throttled down. Atma seals hissed in long exhalations. The crew leaned without leaning. The sorcerer let his eyes adjust to the station's geometry. He did not need to ask for auspex. The returns came with the inevitability of a priest finishing a prayer already begun. Power signature came the whisper from sensory too small to be triumph. Minimal, cyclical, not life support. Something slower. Repeaters, Vesk asked, or beacons, the sensory officer said. Old faint, like someone forgot to blow out a vigil candle. The sorcerer's mouth dried. 3 beats, a pause too. He did not hear it. Not with ears, but he knew it the way a scar knows the blade that made it. The manufactorum's mouth had not lied. It had learned to pronounce the first syllable of a word that waited here, suspended between ruin and function. They eased closer, overlapping the station's shadow until their own looked larger. Docking rails on the nearer crescent were rag-wrapped with something that might once have been banners. The Imperial Aquila glared through layers of soot, beak blistered, one wing charred back to the stub. Beneath it, a strip of stenciled low Gothic survived, Censor Archive 7. The letters ended in a long scratch where some desperate hand had tried to complete another word and failed. Boarding strength, Vesk asked. Enough to die properly, the sorcerer said. Not enough to waste. He had to ration audacity like air. They needed promethium, medicae, food bricks, faith, anything that could be burned into the shape of morale. He cycled the internal vox and listened to his own voice, move through the ship, steady as a pulse. We are not scavengers, he said. We are claimants. This archive held something once prayer, record, data. It still holds the echo of its purpose. We will go with patience and take without haste. If there are spirits within, we will not blaspheme them clumsily. Vesk, with me, Kane on rear. 2 teams to secure the ring. Text to the power nodes. No loose fire. The ship kissed the station's mauled docking collar with practiced tenderness. Mag seals found purchase. Atmosphere tested itself across ancient valves and found enough. The outer doors opened on the slow sigh of a tomb that had decided to remember how to breathe. Inside, the light was already waiting. Not lumen strips, not the riot of emergency paint, candlelight. Hundreds of guttering tapers in clotted sconces, their wax drooling in stalactites, their flames struggling in the thin air like small devout animals. Someone had tended them within the last cycle or 2. Someone had walked these corridors and chosen which flames must not die. They stepped through in column, boots whispering over grit and fallen plaster. The air tasted of ash and a vapor sweetness that might have been incense ground down to its last grit and mixed with oil. The walls bore devotional scrawl in a hand that did not trust its own memory. Litanies begun and abandoned, pictograms of saints whose names had been lost. A scratched Aquila that looked like a bird drawn by someone who had never seen a bird and had only been told what wings were. The beacons thumped again. 3, pause. 2, not sound, pressure. Kane's shoulders twitched in the rhythm, his muscles answering before his mind did. Vesk's hand settled on the young blade's pauldron in a weight that said, I am here and we will not dishonor ourselves. The sorcerer lifted his staff. Wax light crawled up the runes and pooled at the iron cage of the topper like water in a trap. Listen, he said. And they did, with all the parts of themselves that had not been dulled by rations and waiting. The beacon's pressure made a faint tremor through bone. It was a summons written in an alphabet older than this station's cant. Deeper inside, something turned once each cycle, like a prayer wheel pushed by a failing hand. The station had become an organ that refused to stop breathing. They passed beneath a collapsed arch into a chamber whose ceiling had been painted with stars in pigment that had not entirely forgotten how to glow. Reliquaries lined the walls in glass-fronted columns, labels handwritten and then overwritten, names layered until they were only weight. Many stood empty. The glass in the remainder was fogged from the inside, as if breath had once pressed against it and then decided it would rather be elsewhere. At the center, on a dais of welded scrap, a machine squatted like a censer too large to lift. Chains hung from its crown. Runes of the cult Mechanicus had been hammered into its casing, and then crossed out, and then re-engraved in the same places, again and again, until the metal skin had become a palimpsest of fidelity and correction. It pulsed in the station's rhythm. 3. Pause. 2. Between pulses it whispered. The voice did not come from the machine, it came from the interval. Chapter 2. Shackled beneath the Aquila. The whisper inside the interval found a shape he hadn't tasted since iron bit his wrists, and the world smelled of oil, parchment, and ozone. It was not a word but a posture, and the posture dragged him backward through time to the chamber where he had once been made to kneel. The memory rose with the precision of a ritual. A slate floor cold enough to numb the nerves. Lumen strips that did not flicker, because the Imperium preferred its judgments lit. A wall where the Imperial Aquila had been carved so deep the stone bled chalk. When they had brought him in, his boots left a dirty path that ended at the line men crossed when they stopped being men and became objects to be measured. Shackles closed around his wrists with the graceless finality of a door sealed against vacuum. He remembers listening for mercy the way wounded animals listen for water, out of habit more than hope, and hearing only the whir of a picked capture turning to fix his face in the archive's pitiless memory. He had been younger then in ways that had nothing to do with the face the picked would have preserved. Younger as in less bruised by the cost of insisting on questions that polite men did not ask. Younger as in still believing that survival could be reconciled with dignity, if a man was clever enough to choose his moments. Even kneeling, he had tried to keep his spine straight, because he had learned that some inquisitors prefer confession from a collapsed thing, and you owe enemies nothing they prefer. The Aquila on the wall reflected dull light into his eyes until the wings blurred, and the beak lengthened into a line that could have been a blade. They had not announced the Inquisitor by name. They did not have to. Titles are their own introductions. The robed figure smelled faintly of solvent, leather stained with old ink, and a spice that might have been clove if clove had been taught to pray. A data-slate sat on a stand to the left, and it glowed with the bureaucratic serenity of the Imperium's appetite for detail. To the right, a coil of cable hung from an adamantine hook with the patient confidence of a tool that expected to be chosen. Behind him, Boots remembered their drill square. Everything about the room announced a principle that had defined the Empire long before he had learned to speak the warp's dialect. The truth was not a discovery but a compliance test. "You know why you are here," the Inquisitor said, not as question but as liturgical preface. The voice was neither cruel nor kind. Kindness would have implied a variance from function cruelty, a preference, and preference was unclean in rooms like this. "You will speak plainly. You will speak completely. You will be measured by the accuracy of your obedience." He answered with the name they had given him on Prospero and the title he had earned afterward in places where books burned more quickly than men could memorize them. He did not recite from pride. Pride is fancy clothing in rooms like that, and fancy clothing marks where to cut. He recited because an accurate ledger is the first weapon in a fight where records are swords. They asked him to account for a decision made on a mining moon, whose atmosphere tasted like rust and recirculated grief. He had chosen not to surrender an artifact whose inscription sang when touched. He had kept it long enough to confirm that the song was not demonic, that its harmonies aligned with fragments buried in sanctioned lore. He had delayed obedience by hours. He had allowed an unsanctioned choir to form in his mind that hummed in chords the Aquila could not parse. Why? The Inquisitor asked, and in that single word lived the whole cruelty of a question asked too late. Because we cannot defend what we do not understand, he said, and he tasted the danger of it as soon as it left him. Understanding is a tool, and tools in the wrong hands become indictments. He tried again, because the artifact's resonance overlapped with catechisms in Mechanicus hymnals. It might have been a key to a door we already believe exists. You believed, the Inquisitor corrected, and the data-slate chirped with bureaucratic pleasure at the amendment. Belief without mandate is trespass. He held his breath until his pulse receded from his mouth. Then trespass made more sense than breaking a lock we cannot replace. He remembers the Inquisitor's silence then with a clarity he cannot grant to faces. Silence like a scale in perfect balance, willing to go either way, indifferent to whom it measures. You would hold a thing the Mechanicus might claim, the Inquisitor said at last. You would weigh its song against the caution of 1,000,000,000 graves, and you would do this in the Emperor's shadow, while trusting your own ear to distinguish hymnal from heresy. Yes, he said, because pretending otherwise would only sharpen the future punishment when they showed him he had lied. He held the Aquila's stone gaze and did not ask for permission to keep breathing. They did not kill him in that room. Death there would have been too swift for the lesson the Imperium preferred to teach. They shackled him beneath the Aquila for 19 hours while the data-slate digested affidavits and provincial litanies and spool upon spool of footage from the mining moon, some of it his, more of it composed of people pressing their foreheads to rails because the air told them to be patient. He learned in those hours that endurance was only obedience with its mask removed, and that men who hardened themselves against pain sometimes broke under boredom instead. He counted the lines gouged into the stone by boot edges. He recited hexagrammatic words under his breath until his tongue went dry. He refused to name what he was doing meditation because the word sounded smug in a cell, but he also refused to stop because stopping would have been an acknowledgement that they could define the terms of his interior. When they returned, they did not recite a sentence so much as declare the shape of his usefulness. He would live, supervised, because someone had decided that his talent for parsing dangerous harmonies exceeded the risk of allowing him to keep a tongue. He would work where the Aquila could watch him more closely. He would surrender artifacts more quickly and speak less of doors. They gave him a new chain, a commission with edges, papers to wave at officers who distrusted sorcery but trusted signatures, and a list of places where his presence would be tolerated so long as he pretended to loathe it. They kept the artifact. They told him it had been destroyed, which is the lie the Imperium tells when it has discovered a new shelf that needs filling. He accepted the terms, because a man drowning does not interrogate the rope's motives. He left the chamber with wrists that ached and a spine that had only slightly forgotten how to stay straight. He walked beneath the Aquila with the careful gait of someone who has discovered that symbols can be heavier than armor. In the days that followed, he learned to wear sanctioned duty like penance. He led squads into places where ghosts were believed to have learned handwriting. He filed reports that smelled of dust and self-erasure. He watched his own signature become a lesser form of shackling, and he practiced the old art of letting truth bleed into rumor so that men with quieter eyes would continue to invite him into rooms where interesting mistakes kept happening. He also learned the sound of loyalty when it mutated into duty. It is a brittle sound, crisp and clean, and it cracks along lines no one sees until weight chooses them. He learned to love that sound less, because loving it would have been a way of wanting to be told when to kneel. He learned the flavor of sanctioned incense burned too long in too small a room. He learned to measure the distance between Aquila and man by the length of a shadow at dusk. These are not the memories he would most like to claim when he thinks of faith, but they are the ones that rose inside him as he stood on the ruined station's dais, watching the sensor machine pulse 3, pause, 2, and feeling the whisper come from the interval between. Because in that interval lived the exact same posture as the inquisitorial chamber, a demand to speak plainly while allowing no room for a new word. The Imperium had taught him how to survive such intervals. Chaos had taught him how to exploit them. He breathed in the candle-soured air and realized that the next bargain, whatever its shape, would punish the wrong answer with the same elegant neutrality. Behind him, Vesk's boots found a steady spacing on stone, and the men formed a perimeter that did not look like fear because fear was a luxury they had pawned weeks ago. The sorcerer laid his palm against the machine's casing and felt heat only as pressure, like clasped hands in a chapel. He did not ask for a name. Names are doors. Any fool can open a door if the hinges are bored. He asked for purpose because purpose is a thread you can follow through smoke. The interval whispered back with a patience that had endured vacuum and neglect. It offered an address without explanation, a destination without map, exactly the sort of answer the Imperium had always preferred to despise. He understood the insult and almost laughed. The Aquila had shackled him and taught him obedience as a dialect. The warp had unshackled him and taught him appetite as a second tongue. Standing under a dead station's candles, he realized that both languages were now his, and that fluency would be the only shield worth trusting. The interval did not give him text so much as intent. Each pulse from the sensor machine pressed a direction into his bones, and the pauses became questions that awaited a shaped answer. He let the old sanctioned reflexes sit beside the ruin he had made of them, and began the work he had practiced in 2 empires. He tuned his listening. The manufactorum in his ship had taught him the taste of the first syllable. This engine of candles and palimpsest metal offered the second, fuller mouthfeel of a vowel glimpsed from the side. 3. Pause. 2. The pattern belonged to the station the way a name belongs to a bloodline that has forgotten how to pronounce itself. He circled the dais to read the machine's history through touch. Welds told one story, replacements made with borrowed heat, seams redone by hands that had never held a proper torch. Scratches told another, desperate maintenance performed with devotional knives when tools ran out. Over the scarred Mechanicus sigils, he found a newer script, careful and uneven, like a catechist teaching themselves to write in a language the priest had never blessed. The letters were not low Gothic, they were phonetic scaffolding for a sound that did not belong to throats. Whoever had cut them had learned to transcribe an interval. Vesk drifted to his right, the way men drift toward a cliff without admitting to themselves that they want to look over. "You're thinking of taking it," he said, and did not make it a question. "That box, that pulse, you want to carry it back and chain it to our generators until it speaks plain. If it wanted to be moved, it would say so," the sorcerer murmured. He did not remove his hand. "It has made a chapel of this room out of stubbornness. Even machines resist relocation if their arguments have found a pitch they like. Besides, our generators are proud and easily insulted." "Proud generators won't boil paste," Vesk said, and the dryness in his voice held affection like a bone holds marrow. "But a machine that sings might make men remember how to work for reasons other than orders." He did not disagree. He had led enough hungry detachments to know what a ritual could buy for the price of shared breath. "We take its hymn," he said, "not its heart." He tugged a cable that had once attached the sensor machine to the broken ring's power spine. A dull strike of light responded. No, not light, but the suggestion of a path luminous in the way old prayers were luminous under closed eyelids. The pulse grew stronger, pressuring the space between candles until the wick strained. The interval widened just enough for a shape to lean through. It was not a daemon. The warp has a certain theatricality when it wants applause, and this presence disdained applause the way archivists disdain laughter during inventory. It felt like patience wrapped around a wound that had refused to scab. It had no face. It had a posture kneeling with the weight of a ledger on its back. He tasted ink that had outlived its recipes and parchment cured with smoke until it remembered animals. He thought of the inquisitorial chamber because of course he did. The posture matched. Shackled beneath the Aquila, he had learned to make himself readable. Whatever or whoever tended this engine had done the same. "Identify," Vesk said, Because soldiers ask the right questions even when the answers cannot be put on paper. The reply arrived as pressure rearranging his teeth. Not a name, a function. Custodian, not of the Adeptus Custodes. This was reverent mimicry, not that breed of golden truth, but a smaller custodianship, a station keeper's oath inflated by solitude until it cast a shadow as long as devotion. He followed the thread of that oath down corridors in the mind, and found old footfalls, boots with clerical soles, the soft drag of robes that had been patched past dignity, and the rattle of a key ring, whose keys had no doors to claim anymore. Someone had stayed. Someone had kept the candles alive one wick at a time, whispering the interval until their own voice wore down to this mechanical throb. He let his palm flatten on the casing. The old sanctioned habit wanted to pronounce a benediction. The newer appetite wanted to bargain. He did neither. He offered recognition instead, and in that recognition he bent something small, a knee that would not have bent for the Aquila alone or the warp alone. Custodian, he said, the word a breath pasted into air. We see your work. The pressure eased by the thickness of a page. Candle flame steadied. Wax cracked and set. Kane exhaled loud enough for the sound to count as a confession. Vesk's hand left the butt of his sidearm. The station's nerve bundle of ducts and shafts carried the pause away into its bones, and returned with echoes, a proof that they had been heard by a place rather than a person. Is it alive? Kane asked, and heard his own fear make him sound too young. Yes, the sorcerer said, and then because honesty in such rooms paid its own dividends, not in the way you mean. They explored further because the living always do when a structure pretends not to mind. Corridors led them past sideline shrines where reliquaries, once catalogued saint dust, have been replaced with items that only sanctity could justify hoarding. Binding wire sorted by length, unbroken fuses nested like eggs, a cache of unspent low rolled in paper cut from old catechisms. Above one rack, a child's hand had drawn the Aquila with an extra feather on one wing, and someone older had written beneath it in a patient hand, close enough. On a landing the size of a small chapel, a cracked water cistern delivered a thin trickle that tasted of iron rust and gratitude. He felt the interval with every step. The pulses matched the turn of an unseen wheel. They came from below, down a spindle shaft whose ladders had been replaced by knotted ropes and prayers to the patronage of grips. The men descended in pairs, one watching up, one down, the way men who've earned their scars learn to move through verticals. At the foot of the shaft they found a vault door half wedged open with an altar. The stone slab had been dragged there by will and repetition, and its carved saints had lost noses to leverage. A brass plate beside the door, red archive, and a smaller plate beneath it said keep out in a hand that had tried to be stern and surrendered to fatigue. Inside, air lay cool and astonished. Racks filled the room with a forest of slots that had once held data crypts and now held emptiness shaped like knowledge. Many had been scavenged. Absence left neat rectangular ghosts of dust on metal. In the back, beneath a cracked pict of a robed figure handing a scroll to a kneeling soldier, a cluster of machines slept in orderly disuse. He did not recognize the model numbers, and recognition was a thing he had hoarded carefully over a lifetime. The failure stung him like cold. The interval thickened, a throat clearing for a statement that had been practiced and never delivered. He approached the cluster and saw, on the flattest of the machines, a series of rectangles rubbed clean by hands. The rectangles were exactly the size of human palms. He placed his hand where another had, long ago, and then again, until the ritual had become a map of skin into metal. The machine clicked like a tongue finding a consonant. The candles in the hall outside fluttered in sympathy. 3, pause, 2. Then the pause lengthened until it could carry words. It did not speak in any dialect he had ever written. It spoke as stations speak in inventories, in cautions, in the poetry of maintenance logs. He felt the outline of a sequence pressed into his palm. Asset received, asset catalogued, asset forbidden, custodian appointed, custodian exhorted to keep. It showed him a suggestion more than a picture, a reliquary opened under orders, a thing removed under protest, a door sealed under armed witness, a petition filed and never answered. The station had been built to preserve, and had survived by pretending that preservation and denial were the same virtue. When the Imperium forgot to come back, the place took its instruction and gnawed it like the last good bone. He closed his eyes, and saw a different room layered over this one. The Inquisitor's chamber, the carved aquila, the line men crossed, the same posture, the same demand for a plain answer. The machine waited to measure the accuracy of his obedience. "We are claimants," he said at last, softly enough that the sentence did not mistake itself for a command. "We come with need, which is its own violence. We will not break you to take from you. We ask what can be carried without dismantling your vow." The pressure slid along his bones, weighing the sentence like a clerk weighing coins. A slot clicked 3 racks over. Vesk had his pistol up before the second click. Kane flinched. The young always do when rooms move without permission. The sorcerer did not turn. He kept his palm where it was, and allowed the station to decide whether it would interpret his request as authorized. The slot yielded a small box wrapped in waxed cloth, and tied with a cord that had been replaced so often, the knot had learned fidelity. Vesk took it because that is what sergeants do. They touch the first gift to prove to their men that gifts can be touched. He handed it to the sorcerer, and the sorcerer felt the box's weight, and knew it had been measured 1,000 times by hands that could not afford to lose track. Inside, beneath layers of cloth that smelled of smoke and the ghost of resin, lay seals stamped with the aquila so many times that the bird had become a soft blur. Under the seals lay vials. Under the vials lay 3 data crystals, coded to a format that would make their cogitators stammer but not choke. "Medicae," Vesk said, low, not quite trusting the good news. "And records." "Records of what was taken," the sorcerer said, because he had learned to read the shape of a gift by the wound it wrapped. He did not open the crystals, not yet. He lifted his hand from the machine, and the interval held its breath, the way a chapel holds its breath when someone kneels at the wrong moment, and the gods decide whether to take offense. "Custodian," he said, and tasted the word again to be sure it had not spoiled. "We will not ask more than this, until we have proven we can carry it without forgetting your vow. We will return with work, a borrowed charge for a dead pump, a seal for a door that leaks, a wrench in a hand that knows gratitude." The pressure withdrew like a tide that had not yet decided to abandon the shore. The candles steadied. Somewhere above them, a bell without clapper rang in a tone too pure to be anything but accident. Vesk turned the box in his hands, and did not hide the way relief made him softer at the edges. Kane rubbed his thumb over the seam of one crystal, as if heat might provoke meaning. The sorcerer stood very still, and let the room recognize that a bargain had been made at last, if only in outline. He looked at the cracked pict of the robed figure, and the kneeling soldier, and wondered, not for the first time, and not for the last, how many of the Imperium's altars had been built by people who would have understood him if anyone had taught them to pronounce his dialect. "Back to the ship," he said, carefully. "We do not spend this blessing all at once, we will come again." On the climb, the pulse followed them at a respectful distance, like a hymn hummed under breath. The station let them go with the resignation of a caretaker, who has finally met a neighbor after decades of conserving sentences. The docking collar released them with a sigh that could have been relief or habit. On the bridge, their crew watched them come in with the anxious hunger of men who had learned to expect only bad news. He set the vials where light could find them, and did not bother to disguise the way his hands shook. "We will not die this week," he said, and the honesty of that modesty moved the ship more than any larger promise would have. A murmur rolled through the consoles and returned as work. In his chamber, alone, he opened the cloth-wrapped box again, and held the crystals like fragile teeth. The urge to slam them into a cogitator, and tear them for meaning, climbed his throat like panic. He placed them on the desk instead, arranged like 3 small stars, and breathed until the urge knelt. He had promised the station he would not forget. He would keep that promise because it suited his survival. Only then did he notice the scent the cloth had left on his fingers. Not incense, not oil, paper. The memory of a library that no longer had walls. He pressed his thumb to the desk to leave the ghost of it there, and admitted what the Aquila had taught him under its shadow, and what the warp had insisted on later. Obedience is a tool, and tools are for choosing. He dreamed that night. Though he had not permitted himself dreams for weeks, the ship was in silent drift. The Medicae vials locked behind 3 seals. The data crystals turned face down on his desk, like cards in a forbidden game. Yet in his sleep he stood once more beneath the carved Aquila, wrists shackled, and the Inquisitor's face had blurred into a mask of wax, whose features sagged with heat. Every question it asked came in the pulse cadence of the station. 3. Pause. 2. Each time he tried to answer, his mouth filled with dust, and the dust tasted of burned parchment. When he woke, his palms were open as if to catch falling ashes, and the faint smell of candle wax still clung to his skin. He rose without lumen, and crossed the chamber to the void glass. Outside, the wrecked station receded slowly in their wake, a dim knot of light, wrapped in its own exhaustion. The ship's engines muttered the way a sleeping beast mutters, and he could feel the crew's mood thrumming along the bulkheads like a new muscle. For the first time in months, they had a ration of Medicae, and a direction that wasn't just survival. It was not faith, not yet, but it was more than hunger. Vesk arrived uninvited, carrying 2 cups of bitter recaf, and the look of a man who'd spent the last watch counting knives. He set 1 cup on the desk beside the crystals, and stood for a moment, watching the pale rings the station had left on the sensors. Men are calmer, he said. They think the machine blessed us. It did not, the sorcerer said. It remembered its purpose. We only matched its rhythm long enough to be recognized. That sounds close enough to a blessing for men who've run out of definitions, Vesk said, sipping. They'll work better now. Hope is cheaper than sedatives. He did not answer at once. He watched the crystals under the dim lumen. They will also expect more supplies, more omens, more reasons to think following me leads somewhere other than a slow leak. Vesk grunted assent. And you'll have to give them something. Or they'll decide the machine gave us a gift, and you're hoarding it. He turned 1 crystal so its etched side faced up. The glyphs were unlike Mechanicus standard, but he could feel the rhythm of their ordering even without translation. This, he said softly, is what the Imperium always feared. Not heresy, not mutation, not even daemons. Pattern, without mandate. Someone wrote their own liturgy here, and it still works. Vesk's eyes narrowed. Then why take it on board? Because pattern is leverage, he said, and realized his voice had gone too sharp. He drew a breath and softened it. We will need leverage soon. Supplies will not last forever. Enemies will find us. Hope is cheaper than sedatives, but leverage is cheaper than hope. The sergeant watched him a moment longer, and then set down his empty cup. If you're going to use it, do it fast, he said. Before the men decide they've already been saved. When Vesk left, the sorcerer sat alone with the crystals, and the recaf gone cold. He thought of the Aquila's carved wings, of the Inquisitor's ledger voice, of the sensor machine's patient pulses. All the empires he had served and betrayed had spoken in patterns. The difference lay only in who wrote them down. He placed the first crystal into the cogitator at his desk. The screen woke with a shimmer of static that smelled faintly of warm copper. Symbols appeared, formed from lines that bent around one another like strands of DNA. Not words, maps, layers of a single place drawn and redrawn over time, until the older lines became veins under translucent skin. He zoomed and scrolled until the coordinates resolved into a familiar constellation of dead worlds, and there at its heart lay a dot without a name. The groove in the warp that the navigator had called a memory curved directly toward it. His pulse picked up in the cadence of the station's interval. He knew without opening the second and third crystals that they would contain not just a destination, but the ledger of what had been removed from the archive, and where it had been taken. He closed the cogitator before temptation could finish forming. In the dark reflection of the screen, he saw his own eyes and thought of the Inquisitors neither cruel nor kind, only functional. He whispered a fragment of an old Prosperone prayer, not because he believed in it, but because the rhythm steadied his hands. The Aquila had shackled him. The warp had unshackled him. Now he was holding a thread that could knot the two languages into a third. Outside, the ship's engines changed pitch as the navigator adjusted course minutely, and the sound ran through the hull like a breath being held. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Void. The coordinates drew them outward, like a long, thin needle, pulling a stitch through old cloth. The navigator kept them in the shallow band, where the warp's teeth only scraped and did not bite, and the ship learned a new kind of stillness, the poised quiet of a hunter that has finally decided what it wants. Men spoke less, but when they did, their sentences had beginnings and ends again. The Medicae vials steadied fevers. The manufactorum's broken cadence had softened into a workable rhythm, and under it all, the interval from the sensor archive continued. 3. Pause. 2. As if the station's vow had followed them into the dark like a benediction that refused to become a debt. On the fourth watch, the first voice arrived. It did not come through the Vox or bleed across the Geller field like a slick. It came through a memory he did not know he was still carrying. A girl in the red-dusted colonnades of Prospero, kneeling beside a collapsed stack of scrolls, laughing at her own clumsiness as she helped him gather pages that the wind had edited. The voice borrowed that laughter's curve. It knew the angle of the sun that afternoon, and the chalk smell that rose from the steps. It spoke in that remembered warmth, with a tenderness that would have ruined any other liar. "You have been so careful," it said without words, shaping the thought so that it rested where trust rests. "You have carried hunger, as if it were a fragile instrument, and not a blade. Lay it down. Let me lift it. There is a shore ahead." He did not answer. He let the memory stand, uncorrected by time. He tasted the air, warm iron, recaf, oil, the salted tang of the recycler, until the false sunlight faded. The voice withdrew with the dignity of something that expected to be followed. He did not follow. He had learned the warp's first etiquette long ago. Truths arrive dressed in what you most miss. On the sixth watch, the second voice made its offering through a different seam. It chose the navigator's cadence, her exact economy with words, and the way fatigue had taught her lips to shape syllables as if they were rations. It spoke in bearings and corrections, in distances that could be burned or saved, in small approvals that meant work could continue. "We can climb," it suggested, tracing a path up and out of the groove to cleaner lanes. "There is no need to ride the memory so close. Your generator will not thank you. Your crew will not forgive you if the field wavers. You have your Medicae. You have your map. Leave the old vow where you found it, and keep your own men instead." The ship liked that voice. The machine's spirit hummed nearer to its pitch. He felt relief move along the conduits like a cool drink. He almost accepted the counsel simply because it would have calmed things that were not human enough to be lied to properly. He went to the manufactorum instead. Servitors hammered with renewed competence. Heat rolled in sullen waves. He stood beneath the gantries and closed his eyes and counted the pattern until all the advice in the world became percussion. 3. Pause. 2. Not a command, not even a request, a posture. The same posture as the Inquisitor's chamber, the same balance waiting to tip. He whispered back, "Not a bargain, only recognition." The heat eased from cruelty to labor. The ship's hum resettled, almost embarrassed by its brief flirtation with comfort. On the eighth watch, sleep found him. So did a corridor he had never walked. The dream put him in it without introduction. Metal underfoot, vaulted ribs overhead, air like cold ink. At the far end, a Vox grill pulsed with candlelight, and behind its perforated plate, someone breathed as if each inhalation were an argument with gravity. He approached because all corridors are made to be approached. "Custodian," he said, and the grill answered with the sensor's rhythm, slowed as if through water. 3. Pause. 2. Then a shape moved behind the metal, and for an instant he thought he saw an eye, not human, not demonic, but the keen small eye of a thing that had spent too long observing, and had turned observation into a creed. Not the emperor's chosen, not the archmagus's favorite, something humbler and therefore harder to deflect. He woke with his hand lifted to touch a grill that wasn't there, and found his palm open to the dark. He did not tell Vesk about the girl's laughter or the navigator's borrowed caution. He did not recite the corridor to the crew as an omen. He only tightened the ship along the line the crystals had marked and let the warp grumble. The Geller field held. Its hymn grew low and steady, a choir that had learned a refrain and refused to ornament it. The crew learned it too. Men hummed under their breath. The navigator's shoulders unknotted an ounce. Kane stopped rubbing his thumb raw on the seam of his gauntlet. The third voice waited until they crossed a patch of turbulence thin as cobweb. It came in through a wound he'd never confessed, the moment on the mining moon when the artifact's song had lifted like steam from his hands and the Inquisition's black seals had closed on it as if on a throat. The voice knew the humiliations that followed. Supervision, signatures, rooms where truth was administered in drops, and it offered him a coin that glittered with every insult that had taught him fluency. Power, said the voice, with a frankness the others had avoided. Not relief, not safety. Power enough that no inquisitor would dare weigh your obedience again. Power enough that men like Vesk would follow from belief, not necessity. Power enough that the Aquila would blur when it tried to carve itself on any wall you favored. The coin turned in his palm. It had two faces. On one, a warband restored. On the other, a shrine empty of candles. He held the coin and remembered the station's hum. He remembered the child's extra feather and the patient correction. Close enough. That was what a vow sounded like when resources failed to keep up with intention. Not domination. Persistence. He set the coin down inside himself without taking it. The voice waited to be feared. He let it feel his boredom instead. It had the good manners to depart. At last the crystal's convergence became something that Auspex could hint at without embarrassment. A darkness within the dark, geometrically faithful where the warp's hazes preferred vagueness. The navigator found herself whispering not bearings but words that had not been assigned to bearings, and each time she stopped she frowned as if ashamed of having preferred language to distance. The groove, the memory lane, the Empyrean, remembered as she had said, curved inward and down like the lip of a crater almost erased by time. He stood behind her and felt the ship's attention gather as if it too had leaned forward. Whatever it is, Vesk said at his shoulder, it has survived being forgotten. Things built to be forgotten often do, he said. It is the ones built to be remembered that rot fastest, because too many hands touch them, Vesk said, and there was something like tenderness in the old sergeant's voice for the first time in weeks. The Geller Field's chant dipped, not in strength but in pitch, as if the choir had stepped onto lower stairs. The hololithic bled geometry into suggestion. Pressure skated along his teeth, the warp's light thin to thread. Ahead the dark began to show its seams, and in those seams lived shapes that had once had names. He could feel the voices arrange themselves along the approaches like vendors at a pilgrim road, ready with their wares and their individualized flattery. He let them. He had his own stall to mind. He closed his eyes a moment and went back to the inquisitorial chamber, to the Aquila carved too deep. He remembered 19 hours of being measured by the accuracy of his obedience. He considered, as he always did when the memory came, whether the lesson had been a kindness disguised as discipline. He decided, as he always did, that kindness that requires shackles is only efficiency with incense. Then he opened his eyes and faced a new door. The ship slid to the edge of translation, held there by force and caution, and the void became a pane of dark glass. Behind it, a latticework like a cathedral turned inward, ribs and arches and long spines of metal that had drunk the warp's weather until their edges learned patience. Not Mechanicus, not Xenos he had catalogued. Human in proportion, ruthless in function, devotional in the way unadorned machinery can become devotional if it endures long enough without applause. The first beacon pressed against their hull with the old pattern. 3. Pause. 2. It was not the station's voice anymore. It was kin to it, as a vow is kin to another vow spoken in a different accent. He felt men on the bridge lift their heads as if someone had called their names in a language they didn't know they understood. He tasted dust and ash and something sweet that had survived inside a sealed jar. "Translate on my mark," he said, and the order went out like a thread pulled through cloth. The voices went very quiet. The coin turned once more. The girl's laughter receded down its colonnade. The navigator's borrowed caution folded neatly and set itself aside. He raised his staff, not for drama but for balance, and gave the mark. The coordinates drew them outward like a long, thin needle, pulling a stitch through old cloth. The navigator kept them in the shallow band, where the warp's teeth only scraped and did not bite, and the ship learned a new kind of stillness, the poised quiet of a hunter that has finally decided what it wants. Men spoke less, but when they did, their sentences had beginnings and ends again. The Medicae vials steadied fevers. The manufactorum's broken cadence had softened into a workable rhythm, and under it all, the interval from the sensor archive continued. 3. Pause. 2. As if the station's vow had followed them into the dark, like a benediction that refused to become a debt. On the fourth watch, the first voice arrived. It did not come through the Vox or bleed across the Geller field like a slick. It came through a memory he did not know he was still carrying. A girl in the red-dusted colonnades of Prospero, kneeling beside a collapsed stack of scrolls, laughing at her own clumsiness as she helped him gather pages that the wind had edited. The voice borrowed that laughter's curve. It knew the angle of the sun that afternoon, and the chalk smell that rose from the steps. It spoke in that remembered warmth, with a tenderness that would have ruined any other liar. "You have been so careful," it said without words, shaping the thought so that it rested where trust rests. "You have carried hunger as if it were a fragile instrument and not a blade. Lay it down, let me lift it. There is a shore ahead." He did not answer. He let the memory stand, uncorrected by time. He tasted the air, warm iron, recaf, oil, the salted tang of the recycler, until the false sunlight faded. The voice withdrew with the dignity of something that expected to be followed. He did not follow. He had learned the warp's first etiquette long ago. Truths arrive dressed in what you most miss. On the sixth watch, the second voice made its offering through a different seam. It chose the navigator's cadence, her exact economy with words, and the way fatigue had taught her lips to shape syllables as if they were rations. It spoke in bearings and corrections, in distances that could be burned or saved, in small approvals that meant work could continue. "We can climb," it suggested, tracing a path up and out of the groove to cleaner lanes. "There is no need to ride the memory so close. Your generator will not thank you. Your crew will not forgive you if the field wavers. You have your Medicae. You have your map. Leave the old vow where you found it, and keep your own men instead." The ship liked that voice. The machine spirit hummed nearer to its pitch. He felt relief move along the conduits like a cool drink. He almost accepted the counsel simply because it would have calmed things that were not human enough to be lied to properly. He went to the manufactorum instead. Servitors hammered with renewed competence. Heat rolled in sullen waves. He stood beneath the gantries and closed his eyes, and counted the pattern, until all the advice in the world became percussion. 3. Pause. 2. Not a command, not even a request. A posture. The same posture as the Inquisitor's chamber. The same balance waiting to tip. He whispered back, "Not a bargain, only recognition." The heat eased from cruelty to labor. The ship's hum resettled, almost embarrassed by its brief flirtation with comfort. On the 8th watch, sleep found him. So did a corridor he had never walked. The dream put him in it without introduction. Metal underfoot, vaulted ribs overhead, air like cold ink. At the far end, a Vox grill pulsed with candlelight, and behind its perforated plate, someone breathed as if each inhalation were an argument with gravity. He approached because all corridors are made to be approached. "Custodian," he said, and the grill answered with the sensor's rhythm, slowed as if through water. 3. Pause. 2. Then a shape moved behind the metal, and for an instant he thought he saw an eye, not human, not demonic, but the keen small eye of a thing that had spent too long observing, and had turned observation into a creed. Not the emperor's chosen, not the archmago's favorite, something humbler and therefore harder to deflect. He woke with his hand lifted to touch a grill that wasn't there, and found his palm open to the dark. He did not tell Vesk about the girl's laughter or the navigator's borrowed caution. He did not recite the corridor to the crew as an omen. He only tightened the ship along the line the crystals had marked and let the warp grumble. The Geller field held. Its hymn grew low and steady, a choir that had learned a refrain and refused to ornament it. The crew learned it too. Men hummed under their breath. The navigator's shoulders unknotted an ounce. Kane stopped rubbing his thumb raw on the seam of his gauntlet. The third voice waited until they crossed a patch of turbulence thin as cobweb. It came in through a wound he'd never confessed, the moment on the mining moon when the artifact's song had lifted like steam from his hands, and the Inquisition's black seals had closed on it as if on a throat. The voice knew the humiliations that followed: supervision, signatures, rooms where truth was administered in drops, and it offered him a coin that glittered with every insult that had taught him fluency. Power, said the voice, with a frankness the others had avoided. Not relief, not safety. Power enough that no inquisitor would dare weigh your obedience again. Power enough that men like Vesk would follow from belief, not necessity. Power enough that the Aquila would blur when it tried to carve itself on any wall you favored. The coin turned in his palm. It had two faces. On one, a warband restored. On the other, a shrine empty of candles. He held the coin and remembered the station's hum. He remembered the child's extra feather and the patient correction. Close enough. That was what a vow sounded like, when resources failed to keep up with intention. Not domination, persistence. He set the coin down inside himself without taking it. The voice waited to be feared. He let it feel his boredom instead. It had the good manners to depart. At last the crystal's convergence became something that Auspex could hint at without embarrassment. A darkness within the dark, geometrically faithful where the warp's hazes preferred vagueness. The navigator found herself whispering, not bearings but words that had not been assigned to bearings, and each time she stopped, she frowned as if ashamed of having preferred language to distance. The groove, the memory lane the Empyrean, remembered as she had said, curved inward and down like the lip of a crater almost erased by time. He stood behind her and felt the ship's attention gather as if it too had leaned forward. Whatever it is, Vesk said at his shoulder, it has survived being forgotten. Things built to be forgotten often do, he said. It is the ones built to be remembered that rot fastest, because too many hands touch them, Vesk said. And there was something like tenderness in the old sergeant's voice for the first time in weeks. The Geller field's chant dipped, not in strength but in pitch, as if the choir had stepped onto lower stairs. The hololithic bled geometry into suggestion. Pressure skated along his teeth. The warp's light thinned to thread. Ahead, the dark began to show its seams, and in those seams lived shapes that had once had names. He could feel the voices arrange themselves along the approaches like vendors at a pilgrim road, ready with their wares and their individualized flattery. He let them. He had his own stall to mind. He closed his eyes a moment and went back to the inquisitorial chamber, to the Aquila carved too deep. He remembered 19 hours of being measured by the accuracy of his obedience. He considered, as he always did when the memory came, whether the lesson had been a kindness disguised as discipline. He decided, as he always did, that kindness that requires shackles is only efficiency with incense. Then he opened his eyes and faced a new door. The ship slid to the edge of translation, held there by force and caution, and the void became a pane of dark glass. Behind it, a latticework like a cathedral turned inward, ribs and arches and long spines of metal that had drunk the warp's weather until their edges learned patience. Not Mechanicus, not Xenos he had catalogued. Human in proportion, ruthless in function, devotional in the way unadorned machinery can become devotional if it endures long enough without applause. The first beacon pressed against their hull with the old pattern. 3. Pause. 2. It was not the station's voice anymore. It was kin to it, as a vow is kin to another vow spoken in a different accent. He felt men on the bridge lift their heads as if someone had called their names in a language they didn't know they understood. He tasted dust and ash, and something sweet that had survived inside a sealed jar. "Translate on my mark," he said, and the order went out like a thread pulled through cloth. The voices went very quiet. The coin turned once more. The girl's laughter receded down its colonnade. The navigator's borrowed caution folded neatly and set itself aside. He raised his staff, not for drama but for balance, and gave the mark. Translation: hit like a blade, slipping between plates. No clangor. Just the quiet certainty of penetration. The warp's pressure went thin. The Geller hymn fell to a hum. You felt more than heard. And stars returned with a cruelty only reality can manage. The structure filled the forward view, like an answer that refused to explain itself. It was vast without boasting, a cruciform of spines and ribs braided around a central void. Its surfaces matte with oxidized vows rather than paint. Docking spars radiated in disciplined arrays, many sheared, some intact, each tipped with collars that had learned patience. No heraldry, no saints in relief, no scrolling encomia, only utility, honed until utility became a creed. The auspex spoke the language of reluctant machines, residual power, cyclical and slow, venting so spare it might have been breath rationed to prayer. No heat signatures consistent with a living crew, yet the faint radiance of systems that refused to admit extinction. The manufactorum cadence echoed through the hull again, kinship recognizing kinship. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause lay the invitation. Range, Vesk said, the word compressed to keep awe from it. Close enough to knock, the sensory officer answered. She sounded steady. She had decided, for now, to admire without superstition. The navigator pulled her hooded eye away from the scopes, as if leaving a kind conversation, and nodded once. Anchors are conservative, she said. Approach vectors are honest. This place doesn't lie about its edges. He tasted the truth of that, and liked it more than he should. A liar can be bargained with. An honest perimeter leaves you as you came. Bring us to docking spar 12, he said, choosing the least damaged collar on the lower spine. Hands seals, no waste. They moved as men move, when their bodies remember drill, with gratitude. Cables unspooled, and found metal. Maglocks thunked home, in a rhythm that added itself to the vow already crowding the air. Atmosphere bled across old valves, complained, then compromised. In the collar's inspection lens, a thin fog curled and relented, like breath held to be polite. The outer door cycled with the reluctance of a door that had been asked to keep a promise longer than its builders had imagined. Inside, a narrow throat of steel, undecorated, clean, only because dust had never been permitted to matter here. Their boots made small disciplined sounds. The air smelled of cold iron, and the faint sweetness of a preservative that had outlived its recipe. Beyond the inner hatch, a corridor extended with the simple confidence of right angles, bulkheads unadorned, except for utilitarian script, bay numbers, maintenance intervals, warning chevrons placed with catechist care. He felt his shoulders ease in spite of himself. Purposes lived here. He could respect purposes. The first chamber opened like a withheld breath. Racks marched in rows, empty most of them, but kept as if fullness could return at any moment, and would be ashamed to find disorder. Along one wall, a bank of consoles slept with their faces turned down like monks at rest. At the far end, a tall grill, Vox intake, confessional, rose to the ceiling, and behind its perforations candlelight flickered with that same careful economy he had learned to trust. 3. Pause. 2. Not the station's sensor this time, but a larger organ answering the same interval at a deeper register, as a cathedral answers a parish bell with gravity rather than zeal. He stepped close to the grill and felt warmth that was not heat touch his cheek. "Custodian," he said, and the reply moved through bone before it touched ear. Not a word, a ledger's posture, not welcome, not warning, but an assessment waiting to be completed. Vesk's men formed a perimeter that looked like patience, and was in fact, readiness subordinated to curiosity. Cain took rear again, chin high out of sheer stubbornness. The sorcerer laid his palm against the grill, not pressing, only letting skin register pattern, and closed his eyes, so he could see how the place wanted to be read. The reply came as sequence: intake, sanction, triage, dispersal, not a shrine, then, a hub, a place designed to receive what the Imperium could not afford to destroy, to measure it, to feed what could be fed to those who could be trusted to carry the weight, and to hide the remainder where only vows could find it again. He tasted stamped wax and hard decisions. He tasted the clean loathing of redundancy. He thought of the inquisitorial chamber, and felt, not the sting, but the shape of its discipline, repurposed, honest, almost kind in its refusal to embellish. Alive? Vesk asked, softer now, as if the answer deserved respect. As function, he said, as intent that survived its wardens. He lowered his hand, and the grill's light steadied, as if relieved to be permitted to continue without pretense. The consoles along the wall lifted their faces by increments. Green motes crawled across dead glass until the screens found the strength to admit their own emptiness. A single line of low Gothic resolved, steady and unafraid, Q incomplete. He felt a smile threaten, and cut it down. We're not the only ones who owe, he said. This place is an argument interrupted. The floor trembled delicately, the way decks do when something heavy moves far away with consideration. The Auspex officer spoke over the link in a tone that had learned to be reverent, without becoming useless. Multiple sublevels, she said. Circulation intact in a limited loop, power concentrated below the central spindle. No corrosive atmospheres, no obvious traps. A beat, no obvious kindness either. Kindness is expensive, Vesk said. We can afford honesty. They took the spindle stairs 2 at a time in pairs again. As before, the handrails were smooth from use, not polishing. On the second sublevel, they crossed a mezzanine, where pallets had been stacked with precision around an absence exactly the shape of a lander's cargo mouth. He imagined shuttles, settling years ago, mouths open, gulping crates and promises, lifting away into memory. On the third sublevel, a chapel had been cut into a corner without malformed piety. A bare plate, a candle sconce, a plaque, stamped not with a saint, but with a maintenance interval. Someone had scratched through, and replaced by hand. He touched the plaque with 2 fingers in salute to things that refused to be told when to die. At the 4th sublevel, the air grew colder, and the cadence deepened, until it was very near to music. Doors here wore seals, whose wax had petrified into stone. Most remained intact. A few had been broken, and then resealed with a craftsman's shame. Beyond one such door, they found a room arrayed, like the station's archive, but fuller. Cases bore neat tags in a steady hand. Subroutines for machines whose bodies were myths, component schematics, in formats that would make cogitators stutter into admiration. Vials of nanoscopic reliquia, preserved not for veneration, but for reintroduction to industries that had forgotten how to make themselves useful. He did not reach for the nearest glitter. He had learned the cost of greedy fingers in rooms like this. He stood at the threshold, and let the place decide whether he was a claimant or a looter. The cadence filled his chest. In the pause he spoke the only offering he trusted. We can carry, he said. We can return weight for weight. A console lit, not fully, enough to underline a ledger line. A drawer slid with the respect of a clerk, moving a file for a superior, nominally above them, but recognized as competent. Inside lay 3 items, arranged with an elegance he refused to call sentimental. A spool of cable bright with unoxidized promise. A Medicae kit, whose seals wore the Aquila down to a gentle blur. and a data rod, bearing a sigil he did not know, stamped with a rhythm he did. 3. Pause. 2. As if to say, take this, but understand why. Vesk looked to him. The old sergeant's restraint had ripened into something adjacent to trust. We must become the kind of men a place like this recognizes, he said, almost to himself. We will fail often, the sorcerer said, taking the kit, the cable, the rod. But we will fail toward that. Something large moved again below them, not approaching, not threatening, simply continuing a task that had never ended. The ship pinged for attention across the link with the politeness of a beast that has learned not to interrupt feeding. He answered with a flick of thought the crew would interpret as composure, and turned back to the spindle. On the climb he felt the earlier voices arrange themselves along the rails, hopeful as merchants who believed a market had finally opened. He let them show their wares, and withheld his coin. Hope moved through the men, like heat honestly earned. Kane shouldered up, no longer keeping count of his own breaths. The candles in the upper chamber burned straight, proud of their economy. At the dock, seals released without complaint. The collar let them go, as a hand releases a tool that has been used correctly. Back aboard, the air tasted brighter for having been earned. He set the kit where a certain coughing blade would see it first, coiled the cable where the techs would treat it like a relic, and not say so, slid the rod into a reader, not meant for it, and watched the machine falter, then adapt, then accept like a man, learning a new prayer with old lips. Patterns unrolled, not doctrine. Instructions, lists, addresses, a web of places like this, smaller, broken, hinted, stitched at the edge of maps by hands that had chosen obscurity as strategy. He felt the coin turn one more time, power on one face, shrine on the other. He pressed both palms to the desk until the pressure steadied him, and tasted warm iron again. Resolve hammered thin and useful. He did not yet know what waited at the web's center. He knew only that someone had built a way of surviving that asked obedience to function rather than cruelty, and that chaos would cough up its counteroffer soon, smiling with too many teeth. He lifted his head. Plot the next thread, he said, into the ship, and felt the manufactorum answer, and the navigator, and Vesk's quiet assent. Chapter 4. The veil of the sanctioned. The threads on the data rod mapped like veins beneath scar tissue, a cartography of discretion, nodes tucked into the margins of star charts, way stations named in codes that sounded like maintenance intervals, corridors traced where no chartmaker claimed authorship. It was not rebellion, it was refusal, quiet, durable, stubborn. The ship leaned toward the next seam with the composure of a thing that has remembered its purpose, and the Geller hymn adjusted by a breath as choirs do when a cantor lifts a hand no one has to see to feel. Vesk stood at the console with the posture of a man measuring the distance between luck and pattern. The navigator, pale as vellum, whispered bearings that never bragged. The manufactorum kept time. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause, the ship learned to listen. Rumor traveled faster than fuel. Even men who had taught themselves to distrust anything free began to pass small sentences along workbenches, and through the teeth of wrenches, there were other places like the sensor archive. There were stores kept for function rather than loyalty. There were vows that did not require a saint's name to persist. Someone said, only once, and in a tone that refused to name hope, that perhaps the Astronomican's beam carried more than light. The sorcerer let the sentence move, not because he endorsed it, but because rumor is a field you till or it becomes harvest for someone else. He stood with palms on the chart table, and tasted the air, oil, old copper, wax from candles they had placed in their own corridors now, not as devotion, but as punctuation. He knew better than to assign the Emperor's will to any of this. The Golden Throne burned men like incense to keep star lanes from collapsing into the warp's appetite. That was function, not whisper. But men needed room between sanctioned truth and what got them through a watch without breaking. He allowed the gap and kept his speech plain. "We are following infrastructure," he said when Vesk asked if there was meaning beyond logistics. "Someone built a web to distribute survival to places the Imperium's attention could no longer afford. That is not heresy, that is competence, disguised as neglect." They slipped again into translation, shallow as a skimmer crossing a poisoned lake, and at the first shoal the voices returned in new uniforms. One wore the cadence of ecclesiarchy chant punctured by fatigue, pilgrim tones, not promises. It did not offer miracles, it asked for help stacking crates. Another wore the precise vowels of a Mechanicus catechism, but dropped jargon where it needed men instead of machine rights. A third came as simple breath in the Geller hum, a presence like a custodian on night rounds. Neither blessing nor threat, only attendance. He nodded to each, accepted none, and kept the ship on the thin line of function. The second node lay in the shadow of a pale star that seemed embarrassed by its own heat. No architecture rose there, no ribs or cruciform spines, only a scatter of cargo tongues buried in a belt of rock, like teeth deliberately knocked out, and set in a pattern a patient might recognize with their tongue. They docked to a jaw of iron that tasted of dust and old adhesive. The collar opened with honest reluctance, and the breath that met them was colder than policy. Inside, pallets slept in a geometry so disciplined, it felt like prayer had been folded into every lash knot. Stencils marked each stack in a hand that did not know flourish. Gauge wire lengths, ceramic fuses, coil housings, Medicae compounds, water filaments. The place had never expected applause, it expected only to be counted. The interval throbbed through the deck. 3. Pause. 2. The pause asked a question that was not "Who are you?" but "How much can you carry without lying to yourself about it?" He placed his palm on the nearest pallet's seal and waited. No bargaining, no threat. The lock recognized weight rather than rank and yielded. Vesk exhaled through his teeth. The men did not cheer. They let relief become a calmer kind of work. There were records here too, not sermons, not doctrine, but ledgers written in a script that had learned to be handsome by being necessary. He read them with a hunger he would not name love because love makes you careless. Receipts from worlds that had receded into rumor. Dispersal lists to regiments that existed now only as tags on cracked memorial plates. Marginalia, noting repairs done with scavenged virtue and requesting replacements with an etiquette that had no expectation of being answered. The ledgers did not accuse, they did not forgive, they catalogued. Such honesty moved him more than any hymn ever had. At the last page of one book, a different hand had written a note that struggled to keep even lines. It did not invoke Terra, it did not name a saint. It said simply, "If you find this without me, take the wire first, everything else can be bent to fit." He closed the ledger and felt foolish for the sudden heat behind his eyes. "We load wire," he said, and Vesk lifted 2 fingers to the teams. They moved like men who had decided to be the kind of people a ledger would be proud to balance around. When the pallets were secured and the collar sealed, he stood alone a moment in the half-dark of the corridor, and let the place's posture settle into him. He had not asked whether the Astronomican's beam played any part in this network. If priests wanted to call infrastructure providence, let them. He did not. He called it a discipline men had practiced in secret because they trusted function more than ceremony, and because they had learned the Empire's habit of equating obedience with truth was a luxury at the edge. If someone had stretched rumor over it as a veil, that only meant the work had been done correctly. The best way to protect competence was to let superstition draw fire. Back aboard, the navigator shaped a shallower translation than before. The Geller hum deepened into something that made the inside of his teeth feel textured. The third node announced itself not with a beacon but with an absence, a clean subtraction in Auspex returns where debris should have fretted space into noise. They dropped to real space over a yawning crater of silence, and in its dead center drifted an oculus, an armored iris yawning around an emptiness that looked down on them with the patience of old stone. No candles here, no ledgers waiting on shelves, only a single dais under the iris, and atop it an object the size of a child's chest, cross-braced, sealed in red wax that had cracked and been mended by hands that lacked enough wax to be neat. The aquila impressed on the seal had gone soft with repetition. Above the dais, an inscription in sober low Gothic, "This deposit sanctioned by writ of confessional necessity, by order of no one important enough to sign." He considered the distance between sanctioned and sacred, between necessity and confession. He tasted dust, resin, the iron of a cut that had scabbed true. "We lift it," he said, and then added, "because it mattered what kind of men they were making themselves into. And we leave something." Vesk tilted his head. "A candle, a repair," he said, pointing at a cracked conduit near the dock. "Wire." They left a length coiled neat, tucked where a tired hand would find it, and be grateful for having been anticipated. He lifted the sealed chest onto his hip and felt weight, not compromise. The iris watched without comment. The collar released them like a promise kept. In his chamber, alone with the chest, he did not break the seal at once. He sat with it the way men sit with an argument they have decided to win without humiliating the other party. He remembered the inquisitorial chamber, the aquila carved too deep, the 19 hours of obedience measured like grain, and he set the chest on the desk and spoke aloud to no one. "I will not confuse sanction with understanding," he said. "I will not mistake rumor for revelation. I will not call a network of competence a miracle because I am afraid of the work it requires." Only then did he take a knife and cut the seal with the respect of a surgeon who intends to close the wound they make. Inside lay orderly envelopes numbered and cross-indexed, each containing something that would let a small community live a month longer without selling its dignity to a priest with a quota. Filters, gaskets, codes for unlocking rationing machines hard-locked in emergency mode. In the bottom, wrapped in cloth so thin it gloried just to survive, lay a strip of vellum inscribed in the same hand as the wire note. "If you are carrying this, you have already chosen to be useful. That is almost faith." He folded the vellum and slid it under the inkwell where he kept the few words he could not afford to misplace. Rumor would do what rumor does. Someone would say a fragment of the emperor's will had learned to seep into the world through infrastructure. Someone else would counter with a litany about sanctioned charity. A third would insist that only chaos teaches men to cooperate without witnesses. He would not referee, he would choose work. He raised his head and felt the ship tilt, not physically, but in will. Threads waited. A web tugged, patient, built by people who had decided to measure truth by whether a pump ran and a child coughed less at dawn. In the manufactorum the cadence steadied to its stubborn interval. 3. Pause. 2. He tasted warm iron and the steadiness that comes when a man decides to be small in the right direction. "Next node," he said, and Vesk answered from the bridge with a tone that had finally let go of the last of its suspicion and settled into a rarer posture, respect that did not make a cult of its object.
They found the next scene where no star had earned a name. A place the charts marked with nothing but the cautionary emptiness cartographers use when they are tired of writing "here be nothing." The node announced itself through behavior rather than architecture. A scatter of hulls drifting in a slow wheel, nav lights doused, drives cold, each ship holding position with the kind of thrift that says fuel is counted like prayer beads. Auspex returns showed human layouts, a pilgrim hauler with its spine braced by welded devotion, a pair of battered cargo scows repainted so often that history lay under their flaking coats like rings in old wood, a cutter whose vox mast had been replaced by a flagpole, carrying a strip of linen that refused to admit it was a flag. No guns tracked them, no challenge came. The manufactorum cadence pressed through their hull. 3. Pause. 2. But this time, in the pause, breath. The first hail arrived on a low-band vox channel, unencrypted, the sort of open-throat contact used by people who had decided that secrecy cost more than risk. The voice was clerical in the way of lay ministers who had learned to lead by being the last ones not to leave. Hoarse, careful, plain. "This place is Q," the speaker said without preface. "No one owns it. We take turns. If you have nothing, you leave with a little. If you have more than you can keep, you leave some. Don't pray at me. Don't aim your guns. If you try to preach, you'll talk to no one. We are busy. Vesk's mouth twitched at the corners into something like gratitude. The sorcerer let the vox play across the bridge like a breeze that had found a window. He tasted oil, tallow, the metallic clean of water filtered through charcoal, and hope. He keyed his response with 2 words only. Understood. Q. They slotted into a station-keeping orbit with the small flock. No looting, no hails beyond functional notices, line order, exchange intervals, radiation spikes plotted by the cutter's tired auspex. The node itself hung below them, a cuff of lattice tucked into a shadowed rock face, with approach chevrons painted by a hand that had not been trained, but had wanted to be precise. No candles this time, no altar, only a gantry, a distribution cradle, and a small raised platform overlooking both where someone had fastened a slat of wood with the words "Speak Low." They went in light. On the platform stood the owner of the hoarse voice, a woman in a patched coat cut from pilgrim robes and void worker canvas, a rosary around one wrist and a coil of wire tied to the other, as if faith and utility had finally agreed to share the same limb. She looked at them with the absence of ceremony reserved for competent strangers. Behind her, a boy perhaps 13 turned a hand crank that kept a small charger alive, and beside him a servo skull bobbed with the exhausted dignity of a ritual that had outlived its supervising priest. "This cradle runs on trust and grudges," the woman said, "not as greeting. We track what we can. We forget what we must. You look like men with a destination. That's your business. This cradle's business is making sure you leave with fewer reasons to become a story someone else has to survive." He inclined his head enough to sign respect without risking curiosity. "We can pay in cable," he said. "Filters, Medicaid enough to keep a cough from turning into an absence." Her eyes jumped once to Vesk, then back. "Paying in the right shape," she said. "Good." They worked without exchanging names. Ledger lines were cut with a knife into a strip of shipboard plastic and then rubbed with soot, a record no one could steal because no one wanted it. Loads moved along rails and into hands that had learned their weights. A saint's niche had been turned into a lockbox for fuses, because fuses saved more lives this week than saints did, and no one had taken offense because offense had been traded years ago for the habit of not dying where it was easy. Rumors moved too. They came low, and without willingness to prove themselves. A clerk from an administratum satellite, who had gone blind from copying, and now recited freight codes like psalms. A Skitari patrol seen months back across a belt, their footfalls too precise to be hungry, passing through without confiscation, leaving behind a single spool of unasked-for fiber optic like a benediction handed off, while pretending not to notice hands. Inquisitorial cipher burned into a crate's lid, and then sanded down, the ghost of its sigil still visible. The crate kept because wood was rare, and no one here refused rare things simply because they carried old shadows. He let the rumors pass like weather. He did not correct those who wanted to believe the Astronomican was guiding these webs with more than light. When a man asked if perhaps fragments of the Emperor's will had learned to live in infrastructure, he said only, "If men behave, infrastructure behaves. That is a miracle enough." The woman on the platform watched him watch. "You've been measured before," she said when the line thinned. "You move like a man who expects a ledger to be a verdict." "Ledgers are kinder than verdicts," he said. "They forget. They also remember what you owe," she said, and her mouth softened as if at a private memory. "We owe wire. We left wire," he said. "Then you understand the rule," she said. "Leave what you were glad to find." She jerked her chin at the servo skull. "Can you fix that? It stutters on the third beat." He listened. 3. Pause. 2. The skull's cogitator skipped on the second pulse like a prayer losing a word. He set his staff aside and opened the casing with the tenderness of a man embarrassed rast to enjoy tinkering. A solder pin had cracked where vibration had been asked to behave for longer than solder is willing to pretend immortality. He bridged it with a sliver of cable and a touch of heat, and the skull's eye brightened with a shamefaced relief. The beat steadied. The boy at the crank smiled without reserve. The woman nodded once. "Leave what you were glad to find," she repeated. "Not as rule now but as blessing." Back aboard, the crew moved with the measured ease of people whose bodies had relearned the difference between tension and readiness. The navigator trimmed their next translation with a miser's care. Vesk leaned against the bulkhead and watched the men inventory, with the small pleasure of a sergeant who has been given the right tools and therefore does not have to invent miracles out of thin air. The manufactorum kept time. The Geller hymn made its quiet argument against teeth. The data rod's web tugged again. The next seam lay close to a shipping lane the administratum still admitted existed on official charts, a fact that made Vesk's shoulders tilt the way they did when he smelled company. As they approached, Vox bursts pecked at them like patient birds. Most were traffic. One was not. It carried a signature that tasted of solvent and clove, and the clean edges of questions sharpened on duty. The cipher was mild by design, meant to be noticed, not used. It translated as a courtesy any clerk could have managed. Be advised, sanction sweeps in progress, compliance checks routine, queue incomplete. He felt the bridge shift toward a single point. The phrase had stood on the first station's screen with the calm of a principal. Now it came back in a tone that could be read as warning or as liturgy. He did not assert which. He looked at Vesk and saw the old sergeant arranging men in his head, not for a fight, but for the more exhausting labor of being unremarkable. "We don't have to run," Vesk said, which meant "we will if I see your hand move wrong." "We won't," the sorcerer said. "This was built to stand in the open so long as no one brags. We will not be the first to brag." A new hail pinged the outer Vox, human breath on the pause between 3 and 2, steady, deliberate, as if the sender wanted him to hear what they had learned to hear. He answered with silence, the sort that means "I am listening." The reply came in low Gothic, clipped and tireless. "Transit authority. Identify cargo and intent." He tasted warm iron and set his palms flat on the console to keep from reaching for a coin with two faces. "Cargo," he said, letting honesty do the heavy lifting. "Wire, filters, medicae, fuses. Intent to keep moving. Queue complete on our side." The pause that followed was long enough to let rumor braid 3 new strands. Then the voice returned, bureaucratic and almost kind in its refusal to become curious. "Acknowledged. Keep to declared vector. Do not preach. Do not recruit. Do not name saints we cannot verify. Queue incomplete." The link died with professional neatness. Vesk exhaled and rubbed thumb and forefinger together, feeling a grit that wasn't there. The ship held its line. The manufactorum counted. 3. Pause 2. In the pause something vast and sanctioned and tired watched them pass and decided, for now, not to become their problem.
The sanctioned presence did not vanish. It settled along the lane like weather, predictable, impersonal, capable of turning mean if you raised your voice to it. The Vox stayed clean. The Auspex painted a long, narrow shadow ahead. A patrol cutter with a hull that had learned the geometry of admonition, escorting 2 bulk lifters whose paint had been scrubbed back to primer, so the words "sanctioned relief" could be re-stenciled with exhausting frequency. An Adeptus Arbite seal glared from the cutter's prow like a carved verdict. No gun ports opened. No sermons followed. The cutter's flanks carried small scorch marks that told a history of boarding actions performed with more paperwork than blood. "Honest vector," Vesk murmured. "Eyes on the returns. Honest escort. Honest lies somewhere behind them." "Honesty today is not trying to make the web into a banner," the sorcerer said. He tasted the air, the clean tang of recycled faith, the familiar warmth of iron, the dust-dry flavor of ledgers being balanced beyond his sight. The data rod's thread pulled again, and the ship leaned in with the eagerness of an animal that has finally recognized a hand it does not trust but intends to follow anyway. Between their hull and the patrol cutter's shadow, a pilgrim hauler drifted a shade too wide and a shade too slow.
Overspill cargo lashed to its spine had worked loose. A crate skated into the lane and began to tumble, corner catching light. A wrong star. The Arbite's cutter did not turn. Duty has radii, and this fell just outside. The hauler's vox spat a plea, short, embarrassed, the way people talk when they have learned that eloquence is distrusted. The crate's tumble mapped a future in which it clipped a fin on their own prow, and became a story about negligence told in a tribunal's bored voice. Wire, Vesk said, already moving. Cable, the sorcerer corrected, because words mattered, even inside breath.
Bag on my mark.
He let the manufactorum's cadence run through the ship as a metronome for small courage. 3. Pause. 2. On the pause he keyed the thrusters and nudged the ship half a body width off lane. On 2 he cut, held, and the crate kissed their hull with a hollow thud that felt like a confession. Kane on exterior control threw a mag and reeled the box in with a carefulness that would have been tenderness in any kinder universe. They passed the crate hand to hand into the hauler's open lock without paperwork, a transfer done in the grammar the Q had taught. Leave what you were glad to find. The Arbite's cutter's vox opened like an eye. Transit authority, the voice said, clipped enough to pass for discipline anywhere. Deviation noted. State purpose. Correction, the sorcerer said, and let a tired truth do the work. Securing loose freight. A pause long enough for a ledger to be updated. Acknowledged, the voice said. Do not make a habit of charity. It reads as recruiting at scale. The link cut with the neatness of men who can afford neatness. He kept his palms flat until the hum in his ribs abated. The navigator's jaw unclenched without changing shape. Vesk watched the cutter like a man edging past a dog that had been trained to bite only when the owner whistled. The dog did not whistle. The lane flowed. The cue remained incomplete, and therefore alive. They translated at the next seam, shallow, cautious, and came up in a region where void dust hung like scripture rubbed thin, words half remembered by mouths too busy with other kinds of survival. The node announced itself with no architecture, only a line of buoys blinking in the old cadence, each buoy's casing patched with prayer strips turned into weatherproofing by the simple expedient of lacquer stolen from a manufactorum paint bay. At the line's end, an oculus like the one before, smaller, a pupil dilated in the cold. A dais rose beneath it, stacked with crates sealed in the softened aquila. Beside the crates, a freestanding Vox grill waited like a confessional that had never learned to enjoy other people's secrets. He approached without theater. The grill's candle flickered, a poor kid's candle, stump wax, old fat, a token that said anyone can leave light if they refuse to be precious about what counts as light. He touched the casing, and the old posture moved through him again. Intake, sanction, triage, dispersal, Q, he said, and for the first time since the censor archive he added a word he had avoided. Witness. The reply was not a voice, it was the faintest lift in the Geller hymn, the ship's machine spirit adjusting itself by a hair toward a pitch heard long ago. He tasted memory like dust made sweet by a single grain of resin. He understood that this node had never had a custodian with a name. Its custodian had been the habit of men who believed competence was its own prayer. They loaded filters and fuses and a coil of fiber optic that made the techs squeeze their eyes shut as if they had seen light through skin. In return, they left wire again, a Medicae vial, a patch for a suit elbow someone would be glad not to freeze through, and a length of conduit labeled in a hand that would not be mistaken for any other. Close enough. He stood a moment longer with the grill, and let rumor nudge the edges of his discipline. On some worlds, men would call this a fragment of the Emperor's will, a lozenge of providence dissolved into logistics. On others, they would call it heresy to attribute function to anything but discipline. He named it neither. He named it the architecture of refusal, built by clerks and sergeants who had decided they could not afford to wait for permission to be useful. If the Astronomican's beam touched it, it did so the way light touches any honest edge, equally, indifferently, making the thing itself responsible for what it chose to be. On the way back to the collar, a new signal brushed their hull. Not Arbites, not Ministorum, not Mechanicus. The cipher tasted of solvent and clove, and the unadorned grammar of duty sharpened on tiredness. It was Inquisition, but the modest kind, the kind that performs sweeps rather than executions and fills ledgers with small decisions that keep the larger executions neat. The message rode the interval like a polite cough, compliance sampling in progress. Declare if bearing proscribed reliquia. Q. Incomplete. Vesk's hand hovered near his holster out of reflex learned too young. The sorcerer kept his voice level. Declare nothing proscribed, he said into the link, and let the truth be exact. The web he was following was built specifically to keep proscription irrelevant. Filters, fuses, wire, medici, the things that keep men too busy breathing to riot in the names priests prefer. The reply was what bureaucracy offers: the competent silence, the kind that means, for now you are not my worst problem. Back aboard, the ship felt changed in a way he struggled to phrase without sounding like a man about to write a litany. The manufactorum's rhythm no longer sounded like defiance. It sounded like alignment. Men worked with the eagerness of those who can trace the provenance of their labor beyond the next meal. The navigator's third eye slept without flinching under its hood. Kane stopped counting his breaths and began counting crates because numbers that made things move had become his preferred prayer. In his chamber, he opened the next ledger packet and found more than a map. He found a letter copied in a steady hand, no signature, no seal, addressed to no one, and therefore to anyone who would take the work. If rumor must be our veil, let it be thin enough that competent men can see through and thick enough that fools tire of scratching. If the throne's light touches us, let it be as physics, not absolution. Leave wire, take filters, speak low, do not write your name on useful things. He set the letter beneath the vellum, where the first strip had taught him what almost faith felt like in the mouth. He lifted his head, and for a moment only, allowed himself to imagine a net of places where ledgers outweighed liturgies, not because anyone hated liturgies, but because pumps hated poems when they needed seals. He allowed himself to imagine that the Imperium's sanctioned face, tired, vast, accustomed to obedience, could look at such a net and decide that not becoming a problem was the kindest act it could afford. The thought did not become an oath. Oaths were heavy and magnets for attention. He let it remain a working hypothesis, the kind men carry in their pockets and call luck when it goes unnoticed. Next thread, he said, and the ship leaned again. The web pulled tight enough that he could feel a center somewhere ahead, a weight that might be a depot large enough to be called a heresy by people who had never had to keep a queue honest. Or it might be nothing at all, a rumor that had done its job by distributing belief into smaller, more survivable shapes. The Geller hymn lowered another step. The hull shivered as translation took hold. In the pause after 3 and before 2, a final, uninvited voice came, not tender, not hungry, not bureaucratic, familiar. The corridor and its vox grille, the custodian's posture. It asked no bargain. It simply stood attendants at the threshold and waited to see what kind of men they had decided to be.
Chapter Fee. Beyond the golden throne's light, they rode the last threads like nerves toward a heartbeat. The webs tugged, tightening, until even the machine's spirit seemed to lean, eager to complete a sentence it had been made to speak in fragments. The navigator's murmurs shortened to numbers that had forgotten how to be words. Vesk stood with hands easy at his sides, the way duelists relax when the room has decided there will be no witnesses. Kane watched the hololithic with a focus that mistook reverence for attention and would forgive itself later. The manufactorum kept its interval. 3, pause, 2, and the pause lengthened by a sliver, as if the loom wanted space for a final knot. Translation unlatched with a softness that did not flatter. The stars were thin here, and the dark was honest. In it hung a geometry large enough to be mistaken for absence. A ring whose inside face bristled with docking spines. A spindle, hollow, with ribs that trailed cables like roots in a patient ocean. A crown of latticework that drank what little light the region allowed, and returned no boasting, no heraldry, no sermon, only an architecture that had found a way to outlive inspection. The auspex found breath where it should not,
circulation in closed loops, power, stepping down through converters like a monk descending stairs. No life signatures consistent with a population. No weapons unkind enough to require naming. A single beacon pressed its little forehead against their hull and whispered the oldest cue they knew. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause, the smallest courtesy. You are seen. He answered without ceremony. The caller accepted them with the patience of a clasp that has been opened and closed by hands that never intended to own. Inside, the air had the faint sweetness of a preservative that did not remember its manufacturer's name. Grids were clean where hands could reach, and dusty where only dignity had kept the dust from forming clots. The first chamber was a mouth, the second, a throat, the third, a hall whose proportions refused to be grand even while being large. Racks stood in ranks. Consoles slept the way good tools sleep, facing down, content to wake if woken. The interval throbbed not louder but lower, its base thick enough to settle into bone. They spread with the competence of men who have learned that curiosity can survive alongside caution if neither pretends to be the other. Vesk's team pushed left along service ducts that had been labeled by a hand fond of decimal order. Kane held rear and discovered, with a kind of embarrassed joy, an entire wall of nothing but cable, gauges sorted, lengths coiled, each spool tagged with a number, and a word that did not name a saint: pump, lock, coil, throat. The navigator, hooded eye-gloved and idle for once, stood close enough to the main console to taste its hum and not so close that superstition could claim her. He moved toward the center, toward the spindle, where ribs converged like arguments that had learned to share a conclusion. The floor there had been worn by traffic into a sheen that reflected their boots without vanity. At the spindle's core waited an oculus larger than any they had seen, an iris locked open around a void that was not an absence so much as a patience held in reserve. Beneath it, a dais of simple plates bolted together, and upon it a machine that had learned to be a shrine by doing one thing correctly for so long that the noun had conceded. Censor, archive, ledger. None of those words fit, and all of them did. He laid his palm upon its casing, and let the posture return. Intake, sanction, triage, dispersal. Then a new step, not a word but a breath between words, witness. He tasted resin and dust, and the ghost of vellum. He felt the long labor of hands that had refused to become saints because saints become excuses, and excuses rot warehouses faster than damp. When the pause came, he placed his offering on it, as he had taught himself to do in rooms that preferred weight to cleverness. We can carry, he said. We can return weight for weight. We can keep the veil thin where rumor is useful, and thick where fools grow teeth. The reply was not a voice. He had learned not to expect voices from disciplined intent. It came as permission extended to a limit he could read without shame. Drawers unlocked in a sequence that remembered cues. Racks lit their taglights with the modest pride of inventory that has been kept up without applause. A slow processional of small competence began. Filters dressed themselves in boxes, fuses admitted numbers, cable acknowledged cutters. Medicae kits rolled their old seals under his thumbs and surrendered their vials with the resignation of tools that know they will be used and not displayed. Vesk watched, and for once the old sergeant's suspicion had nothing to push against. This is what the opposite of plunder looks like, he said, as if tasting a phrase he had not expected to find on his tongue. He nodded and let the room set the pace. They worked until their ship's belly took on a satisfying ache. Men sweated without speaking in tones that asked to be believed. The machinist's apprentice from the manufactorum stood still for a full minute, gazing at the cable wall as if at a sunset he refused to praise in case praise cheapened it, then took exactly what his list required, and not one length more. When the last crate settled into the lock with the completion click, a body hears as rest, the interval deepened, and the new step returned. Witness. He looked up into the iris and felt the thin prickling at the back of his scalp that comes when rumor takes a breath to survive saying something true. He did not kneel. He had knelt beneath the Aquila, and learned how little kneeling teaches a man about the shape of his interior. He did not raise his staff as if blessing could be borrowed by silhouette. He stood with his hands open and spoke the only currency that had value here. We will keep what keeps Q's honest. We will not write our names on useful things. We will not preach. We will repair. We will leave wire. Something like a draft moved along the ribs. The candles, there were candles, tucked without piety into maintenance brackets, burned steadier. The machine's casing warmed by a degree he felt as courtesy. The ledger light on a console brightened and presented a single line in low Gothic, so plain it offended nobody. Q incomplete. He almost laughed then, not from scorn but from the relief men feel when a truth is small enough to carry in the teeth without cutting the tongue. Always, he said. Only then, when the vow had found its correct posture in the room, did the other offer arrive. It did not come from the machine, or the iris, or the ribs. It came from the seam where hunger lives. The seam chaos knows how to pry with a fingernail polished by centuries of patience. The voice took none of the shapes it had used before. It did not arrive dressed in lost laughter or in the navigator's economy. It came as a truth he preferred, and therefore rang false at once. You could own this, not the crates or the cues, but the posture. You could write your name on the pause between 3 and 2. You could teach men to say your syllable as they say witness. And for once, you would not have to ask permission from the Aquila, or pretend you do not enjoy the asking. Power without tribunal, appetite recast as him. He did not answer for 3 breaths. In those breaths he tasted wire, filters, the rubber smell of seals, the sweet sting of preservative air. He tasted the letter under his inkwell and the child's extra feather, and the way Vesk's shoulders had unlearned a piece of suspicion and replaced it with a more expensive posture respect. He tasted the manufactorum's honest stubbornness and the lay minister's speak low and the Q's refusal to make saints out of clerks. He answered by counting 3, pause, 2. On the pause he placed a sentence that was not pious enough to be stolen by liturgy. No, the word fell without echo because the room had no use for echoes. The offer did not hiss or rage. It did what competent threats do when refused by men who know what they are working on. It made a note and withdrew to look for a weaker seam. He saw then how the chapter would be told by people not present. Some would say a fragment of the emperor's will had settled over the spindle like dew and turned logistics into liturgy. Others would insist a sorcerer had found a way to launder appetite through charity. A third, more tiresome group would write ledgers of prescription and call the architecture of refusal a heresy merely because it had chosen competence over permission. He would argue with none of them. He would load wire. Vesk cleared his throat the way men do when the right words cost more than the wrong ones. We can go, he said, and come back, and keep the veil thin, he said. Thin enough that competent men can see through, thick enough that fools tire themselves scratching. Cain, who had learned to love numbers that moved crates, looked up through the iris as if expecting a face and found only the generous patience of engineering. What do we call this place? He asked, awkward with the innocence of someone who still thinks names are owed. Nothing, he said, and let the mercy settle in. If we must, we call it Q, and then we leave. They turned with the economy of men who have spent their day correctly. At the collar, seals released. The ring let them go with relief that felt like pride and not like abandonment. Back aboard, the ship received weight and purpose without complaint. The navigator adjusted bearings by fractions that tasted like thrift. The manufactorum kept time. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause an entire discipline breathed, and did not require applause. On the bridge, as the web center shrank to an honest dot behind them, a message ghosted the outer vox. Not Arbites, not Ministorum, not the brittle courtesy of junior Inquisition. The cipher was so modest it was almost rude. It translated into a sentence any clerk could have typed, and every clerk would have risked for precisely this Q, incomplete. Continue. He placed his hands on the console, and felt the warm iron of resolve he recognized now not as faith, but as a habit many men could share without kneeling to one another. The Geller hymn lowered by one step, ready for shallow translation. Vesk looked at him and found his own reflection steadier than the last time. Cain counted coils and smiled.
because numbers finally matched hands. The ship leaned into the next thread with the patience of a vow that has decided to survive.
They fell back into the shallow band, where translation feels like standing on a frozen lake. The surface holds, but you hear water moving under your boots. The Geller hymn steadied, as if it had learned the tune for good. The data rod's web unfurled, more threads than any one ship could honor in a lifetime. A humility that reassured him. Conspiracies aim for totality. Competence accepts incompleteness as proof of sanity. He let the minor nodes pass into the ship's log, addresses for wire and fuses, coordinates for filters, and the plain decencies that keep a man from dying in the middle of a sentence. The web's center receded. New centers suggested themselves like stars that refused to be the only ones. Rumor arrived on the Vox in the bureaucratic grammar of permission. It carried the same solvent and clove taste he had learned to read as the modest Inquisition, the kind that preferred sweeps to dramas, sampling to spectacle. The message was unglamorous, and therefore immediately credible. Routine audits pending at the lane's edge, declarations required, preaching frowned upon, recruiting unwelcome, queue incomplete. He answered as he had learned to answer, with nouns that did not need adjectives. Wire filters, medicae, fuses, intent to keep moving. A pause shaped like a ledger turning a page. Then the kindest sentence any empire can offer a competent stranger. Proceed. Vesk let out a breath. He refused to call relief. We are too small to swat, he said. That is our armor. We will stay small, the sorcerer said, and allowed himself a private smile at the heresy of that vow. In a galaxy where men sharpened their names against each other like knives, small and many, the manufactorum answered with its clean insistence. 3. Pause. 2. The pause carried a new texture, the grit of work already promised. In the lower decks, the tech spooled cable with reverence that refused to embarrass itself by speaking. In the medicae, vials found the hands that shook least. On the mess line, someone began telling a joke about the day the Arbeitscutter declined to notice charity. The punchline was not laughter, but a silence stingy with pride. He went alone to the void glass. The stars ahead wore their cold as if it cost them nothing. The web's new threads lay faint as handwriting under frost. He set his palm to the sill and felt the fields through metal the way you feel a psalm through old wood, not as belief, but as pressure shaped into patience. The corridor from his dreams returned, the Vox grill's perforated face, the breath behind it measured in work hours rather than revelations. Custodian, he said to no one, and to everyone who had ever stacked crates by candle, we saw your posture. We learned your pause. The reply came the way replies from patient things come, as a small exact permission disguised as coincidence. A blip on Auspex where no blip should have been. A buoy blinking the old cadence with one diode failing on the second beat. A freighter's faint distress call so embarrassed by its own need that it used file transfer bandwidth to whisper help. They altered vector by a hair. The freighter's problem was low and decent. A heat exchanger limping into failure, the kind of death that takes a ship in tidy increments while no one is looking. They matched course without sermon. Vesk's team carried cable, seals, a gasket that fit because gaskets have the courtesy to obey numbers. The exchanger coughed, reconsidered, and agreed to live. The freighter's captain hailed with the politeness of a man who has forgotten how to be suspicious without wasting time. We owe, he said, and meant it. Leave wire, the sorcerer answered, because the grammar mattered more than any story they might tell later. Take filters, speak low. The line went quiet for 3 heartbeats, then a laugh arrived, not grateful, not awed, simply relieved to find a sentence he could repeat without lying to himself. Q, the man said, and cut the link because there was work to do. Back in his chamber, he opened the drawer where the vellum lay under the copied letter. He read the lines without moving his lips, almost faith, thin veil, speak low, do not write your name on useful things. He slid the drawer shut before ritual could render it precious. On the desk, the cogitator glowed with a stubborn geometry,
the data rod had taught it to accept. He zoomed until small nodes filled the screen like barn lights seen from a field. If the Astronomican's beam touched them, it did so as physics touches any edge, equal, indifferent, reflected according to surface, not according to prayer. He found this fairness easier to trust than mercy. Sleep took him when he refused to call for it. He dreamed without drama. The inquisitorial chamber returned stripped of threat until only the posture remained. Knees against cold stone, wrists raw, the Aquila's wings carved too deep. He stood rather than knelt, because memory is obedient, until you ask it to be useful. The Aquila stayed a bird instead of a blade. The custodian's breath behind the grill kept time. 3. Pause. 2. Witness. He woke with his hand open as if to receive weight. He had none to place there. That, he knew, was the right way to wake. Sanctioned weather ebbed and flowed ahead. The Arbite's cutter reappeared as a shadow one watch later, escorting a convoy that wore its charity like a hair shirt. Their vox exchanged the gentilities of mutually disinterested competence. Proceed. Do not preach. Q. Incomplete. The cutter did not ask after names. The convoy did not bless them. The web remained unremarked by those whose job it was to remark things. He tasted iron, and allowed himself the smallest superstition he was willing to carry. Perhaps the Imperium's vastness could be kind simply by being busy elsewhere. Next line, he said to the ship, and the ship leaned, obedient to function rather than romance. In the manufactorum, the apprentice who had learned to stare at cable as if at a sunset tied off a coil and chalked a note on the wall where grease had made a blackboard of the paint. Leave what you were glad to find. Someone added below it, smaller, reluctant to crowd, Q. Incomplete. No one signed. The chalk dust drifted to the deck, secular as snow. He returned to the bridge as translation gathered under their feet. Vesk rolled his shoulder, a man settling a pack that finally fit. Kane counted aloud and forgot to be embarrassed about it. The navigator's hood lowered another fraction in trust. The Geller hymn stepped down one note and held. In the pause after 3 and before 2, a final voice made its last offer. Not a bargain now, not power for appetite, not comfort disguised as prudence. It came as a question that would have been beautiful if beauty were cheap. You have built yourself a creed of refusal. What will you do when refusal is not enough? He did not answer. The web ahead glittered with addresses that were not answers and therefore useful. He set his palms on the console and pushed them forward the way you push a cart that has learned its hill. Carry, he said, not to argue with the question but to survive it. Carry, and return. Keep the veil thin. Speak low. Leave wire. The ship took the translation with the quiet confidence of a vow that had no taste for witnesses. Stars blurred into thread. The choir held its note. The pause waited, as it always would.
They came out of translation on the ragged edge of a system that had learned to ration daylight. A faint, elderly sun burned behind a gauze of particulate, and a brace of moons herded a desolate world along a track that had not needed observation in a century. Auspex mapped the usual wreckage of neglect, beacons that blinked without conviction, a dock spindle scorched to a stump, a scatter of metal bones gnawed down to alloy. But beneath the noise lay order, a line of buoys blinking in the old cadence, and beneath them a pier punched into the planet's upper air like a nail, refusing to rust out. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause, an instruction she had never spoken aloud. Down. The navigator measured the fall with the stingy care of a woman who had learned to carry weight without being thanked. We can ride the pier's wake, she said, voice thin after translation. Geller won't help us in atmosphere. We trust physics and the pier's temper. Trusting temper is what got your favorite servo harness kicked across the manufactorum, Vesk said, but with a softness that made the memory gentler than it had been. Temper earned, the sorcerer said. Physics earned too. Take us. They dipped. The hull trembled the way old men tremble when they've had enough of youth. Air clutched, then consented. The pier rose beneath them more as a refusal than a structure.
A shaft of reinforced lattice laced with guy lines into the planet's skin, its surface crowded with platforms, hammered level by hands whose patience outlived their tools. On the southern edge, clamped to the lattice with a stubborn ingenuity that embarrassed more elaborate engineers, hung a long shed with a sawtooth roof and doors wide enough for an obsolete lander to fit if it tucked its shame. On the doors, someone had painted in exact patient low Gothic, Q. They sat down with the delicacy of men who were proud of not breaking what they landed on. The air carried the iron taste of dust that had learned religion, the sour of old oil, the faint sweetness of a preservative cobbled from kitchen secrets, and beneath all of it, human breath arranged toward work. Men and women in patchwork smocks and void-borne coats, stiff with grit, moved along marked lanes with the grace of those who sleep near machines. A bell rang somewhere, not for prayer, but for turn-taking. The queue manager wore a coat that had once been priestly, and now was merely useful. Rosary on one wrist, wire on the other, like the woman at the cradle. Perhaps the grammar had propagated on purpose. He looked at them without ceremony. "Speak low," he said. "If you've brought saints, leave them in the ship." "We brought wire," Vesk said, nodding toward the crates. "Filters, Medicae." "Good," the man said. "Saints clog aisles." They worked. Crates slid to marked squares. Ledgers were cut into strips of plastic and rubbed with soot. A boy chalked names with a hand that disdained flourish. A woman checked seals by touch, her fingers remembering numbers in braille the way true competence does when eyes grow tired. The sorcerer let the peer's intervals pass through him, until his own breathing agreed to be coordinated by other people's labor. 3. Pause. 2. In the pause, he heard a cough. It was particulars more than drama. A child hacking at the end of a line turned away from the draft. A man's hand steadying a shoulder that could not stop shivering. A bundle of blankets arranged to look like hope rather than a bed. The Medicae Q had learned to triage down to the sliver. He tasted the antiseptic sting of boiled tools cooled too fast, and the sweetness of low burn to quiet nerves. He did not push to the front or burden anyone with introductions. He set the vials and filters where the line's first hands could reach, and let smaller gravities move outcomes that did not need his name. "Your ship's clean," the manager said when the pressure eased enough to afford a conversation. He meant the discipline, not the dust. "We've had visitors bring sermons and leave pamphlets." "Pamphlets don't mend straps, you mend straps." "Wire mends itself when properly requested," the sorcerer said, bending to splice a harness raw at the elbow. He spoke to the wire as he worked, not in any language that pretended sanctity, but the way men talk to stubborn materials, a scolding, a promise, a bargain with friction. The harness consented. A child stopped coughing because the line had moved, not because miracles had happened. It was enough. A call came over the shed's vox, one chime shaped from 2 tones, bureaucracy's favorite interval. The manager's mouth thinned. "Transit authority," he said. "You can hold a queue open for years, and it still has to answer when the door knocks." The voice that filled the shed arrived dry with distance and honest with fatigue. "Compliance sampling," it said. "Solvent and clove faint. Declare proscribed reliquia. Identify preaching entities." Q incomplete. It was the modest Inquisition again, the sweepers of spoiled priesthoods and lazy charlatans, the ones who kept their ledgers clean, so that the dramatic end of the same institution could keep its conscience uncluttered. The sorcerer keyed the reply, and let nouns do the work, declaring nothing proscribed. Contents: wire, filters, fuses, Medicae. Intent to keep moving. No sermons. Q complete on our side. On ours it never is, the voice said, something like humor stowed in its pocket and not spent. Proceed. Do not recruit. Speak low. The link cut. The manager snorted. They always say proceed as if they invented the vector, he said, not unkindly. They hear the interval too, you know. They just don't say it with their mouths. Maybe their ledgers are the prayer. the sorcerer said, surprising himself with the lack of scorn in it. He had learned to taste scorn before speaking. It had gone stale. Paper saves us from rhetoric. The manager laughed, short and grateful for the permission to be amused by an empire that had mostly taught him to live quietly under it. Paper saved my marriage, he said. I stopped trying to write poems about rationing, and just counted. Counting is kinder. A tremor ran through the pier then, not danger, but a big breath held and let out. Up along the lattice, a lander's shadow crossed the sun, and came down crooked, hot and embarrassed. Its decals had been scraped down to primer. On the flank, letters hurried back into existence. Sanctioned relief. The lander's ramp kissed the pier and coughed out crates. Arbites stood in the corners of the shed like punctuation marks in an argument too tired to escalate. No batons swung. No sermons arrived. A junior clerk with ink on his fingers and awe under his discipline lifted a hand too formally to their manager, then too awkwardly to the sorcerer, as if the grammar for addressing competence from outside had not been fully written. There is a form, he said, lifting a slate that had memorized its fields. Receipt. Signatures. The manager looked at the sorcerer with an irony that refused to sharpen into contempt. You can sign, he said. Names are for forms, leave the useful things unnamed. He signed with the hand he used for work, stroking letters like the backs of beasts he respected, but never rode. The clerk watched his penmanship with the tenderness of a man who only ever sees other people's hands holding pens right before they turn into weapons. Proceed, the clerk said, the word tasting newer in his mouth than on the vox. He looked at the Q sign on the door as if he wanted to transpose it onto the center of his slate. Q, he began, then stopped, frightened of metaphors. Incomplete, the sorcerer supplied, rescuing him from poetry. Keep it that way. They finished without applause. The lander lifted, trying not to look important. The Arbites steadied their jawlines and pretended to be invisible. The shed's hum resumed the comfortable pitch of money, counted in bolts and seals. Vesk leaned on the crate stack, not from weariness, but for the right to pause where men were doing things rightly. Kane found a chalk and a patch of wall. A glove had polished bare, and wrote in small letters that did not embarrass the room. Leave what you were glad to find. Someone below it added, reluctantly affectionate. Speak low. A child, emboldened by the absence of shouted doctrine, drew a bird with one extra feather. Close enough. On the climb to orbit the ship carried new weight honestly. The web's threads pressed against the hull like the fingers of people who would never meet each other, and did not require it. The Geller hymn reshaped to the shallow register where the choir could hold the note for weeks. In the manufactorum, the apprentice rewound cable and did not sigh on the second beat. In the Medicae, a vial found an arm that would not shake. The navigator's hood fluttered once with a sleep that had chosen trust. At the void glass, stars waited without judgment. He stood with palms on metal, and counted the beat that had kept him from kneeling to the wrong things. 3. Pause. 2. The voice that had promised ownership returned one last time, not unkind. A craftsman trying a final pass on a work he respects enough to keep working at. Write your name, it suggested, generously. Leave something of yourself or you will be mistaken for a rumor. He answered with the grammar he had decided to live by. He left wire. He took filters. He spoke low. He refused to write his name on useful things. The rumor would move anyway, as rumors do, dressing logistics in liturgy where needed, in heresy where profitable, in paperwork where bored. He felt the warm iron of resolve settle into a shape that could be carried without a shrine to prop it up. Next thread, he said. The ship leaned. The web adjusted. The choir held. The pause waited. Patient. Sufficient. Never finished.